Should we start or maybe give a few more minutes?
Maybe we'll wait for a few, like 3 minutes.
Okay, cool.
To let people in. Yeah. Yeah, now people coming.
Yeah, let's start at 11:05. Yeah. 5 minutes. Okay, yeah, I think we should start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the OpenEyes workshop on eye gaze for AR, VR, and in the wild. It is my pleasure to begin the session by introducing our first invited speaker for the session, Professor Pramod Kharganikar. Professor Kharganikar has had a distinguished career both as an academic researcher as well as an administrator. And here are some of the key highlights from his distinguished career. Professor Kharganikar received his PhD in electrical engineering from University of Florida in 1981. And since then, he has been on faculty roster at University of Michigan, University of Minnesota, University of Florida, and more recently at University of California, Irvine. He served as a Dean of Engineering and Ekis Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at UF from 2001 to 2009. And that is where I met him first as a young researcher. He also briefly served as a Deputy Director of Tech at ARPA-E from 2012 to 2013, following which he was appointed by NSF as an Assistant Director for Directorate of Engineering, a position that he held until 2016. In June, he assumed his current position as a Vice Chancellor of Research and Distinguished Professor in EE and CS at UCI. Dr. Kharganikar's current research interests include systems and control theory, machine learning, and application to smart grids and neural engineering. And we are glad to have him join our workshop and share some of his thoughts on Kalman filters and its application in sensor fusion and eye tracking. With that, Dr. Kharganikar, start. Yeah.
Good day, everyone. My name is Pramod Kargonkar, and I'm recording this presentation from my home in Irvine, California. Let me begin by saying how pleased I am to be part of this workshop at ECCV. And I want to start by thanking Sachin Talati, who is a friend and a collaborator from many years, for inviting me to this workshop. I'm just delighted to be here and share some thoughts with you. My talk is entitled Kalman Filtering, Sensor Fusion, and Eye Tracking. It's in 4 parts. I begin with an introduction to Kalman filtering, then multi-sensor, multi-rate fusion. Then I'll talk about distributed, decentralized Kalman filtering, and close with some thoughts on potential for eye tracking. At this point, it's good for me to tell you that I really know very little about eye tracking. I think the reason Sachin invited me was because of my connections to Kalman and Kalman filtering. And that's a great place to begin. Kalman is probably one of the most famous scientists, certainly from control theory world of last many decades. He's the founder of the field. And I was very lucky to be his graduate student, one of his last graduate students. He passed away in 2016, just about 4 years ago. And there is a plethora of articles on him, and I've highlighted some of them here. An obituary that appeared in Control Systems magazine, and a tribute to him by several of his students. And then I wrote 2 essays on him, a personal tribute to him, as well as some of my reflections on the way he thought. So let's jump in. What's Kalman filtering? Now, if you know Kalman filtering, this is too elementary for you. But if you don't know, this will be a very quick introduction, and it's sufficient for me to talk about the rest of my ideas. So Kalman filtering, we start with a system model, essentially a linear system and Gaussian noise. So the system is given by a difference equation, x at time k plus 1, t is the sampling period, is a linear function of the previous state at the previous instant, akxt, plus an input term, bkut, and a noise term, w. Along with the state equation, you have measurement equation given by the second equation, namely y equals cx plus du plus v. V is the measurement noise. And then for the noise, we make assumptions that it's Gaussian and zero mean. And we characterize that then using its covariance. So covariance of the initial state x0 is given by p0. Covariance of the system noise is given by Q, and covariance of the measurement noise is given by R. Everything is a function of K, function of time. It doesn't have to be. You can do the simpler case of linear time invariant, but it really makes very little difference. So we just stay with this more general version. So it's a linear time varying discrete time system. Sampling period is T, state variable is X, input is U. This is supposed to be known. And so essentially, you can take this out of all the equations. And for simplicity of this talk, I'm just going to make it equal to 0. But it creates no big deal. Process noise W, measurement noise V. With that setup, the Kalman filter equations are very, very simple and straightforward. And they come in two parts. One is what do you do with the estimate of the state? And then what do you do with all these covariances? Okay. So the estimate of the state is propagated in time in two steps at each instant of time, or each sampling period. One is what is called the time update. That's the first equation. So suppose you had an estimate of the state at time kt using all the information that was available to you up to that time instant. So that's what the notation x hat of kt given k means. You knew everything up to time k. What's your best estimate of x at time kt denoted by x hat of kt? From there, to calculate your best estimate of time of the state at time k plus 1t, that is the next time instant, all you do is propagate that estimate through the state matrix A of k. So you multiply A of k times the prior state estimate. That gives you the estimate of the state at time k plus 1t. Now, what about this estimate x hat at time kt, given all the information to time k? That's also very simple. What the Kalman filter says is that equals its estimate given information up to time k minus 1. So that's the first term in the second equation. And then you add to it a term that depends on the difference between the measurement y at kt minus your estimate of y given your best estimate of x hat given information up to k minus 1. So you knew up to k minus 1. At time kt, you get new measurement y of kt. You subtract from y c times the best estimate of your state up to information k minus 1. You look at that difference, that's called innovation. That's the new information in your measurement y. You multiply it by a matrix L, that's called the Kalman gain, and you add that to your estimate of the state at time kt given information up to k minus 1. The second equation is called the measurement update, and you can see why. Because what it is doing is telling you, you had information up to time k minus 1. You had an estimate. You get new information at time kt. What do you do with it? You subtract from it your best estimate of y, that's c times x hat, multiply by L, add it up. That gives you x hat at kt time, given k. Now, if you combine the two equations together, now you can see it gives you a recursion of going from best estimate at time kt given k minus 1 to best estimate time k plus 1t given k. And you can just propagate this further. So two steps, a measurement update and a time update, and you just keep recursing. Now, what about this gain L? Okay, that's the new thing here. This L is calculated using propagation of the covariances. So the first equation in the second half of the slide tells you how do you propagate the covariance of the state error at time k given all information up to time k. So P inverse of k given k is basically a notation for the covariance of the error in estimation. And that propagates as P inverse of k given k minus 1. So what you knew up to k minus 1. And then you add to it a term corresponding to C times R inverse. Now what is R? Remember, R is the covariance of the measurement noise. So what it tells you is your error in state estimation increases by something that relates to the measurement noise, which makes sense because you are adding something based on Y in estimating X hat. Well, since Y is noisy, it is potentially going to increase error. And this formula tells you exactly what the error in what the covariance increase is going to be. You calculate L using that formula, and then you propagate this covariance P to the next time step using the state equation. So that's the last one, A times P k given K, A transpose plus the measure, process covariance. Very beautiful, simple set of equations, recursive, and tells you the best estimate. And what Kalman proved is that this is optimal, assuming linear dynamics and Gaussian noise. He did this in the late 50s, and it's probably, with no exaggeration, the most important and impactful result from control theory over the last many decades. That's why he's the father of the field. And I would argue that it's one of the most important results to arise from engineering, particularly engineering theory or mathematical engineering. Is equivalent to Bayes' theorem. So under linear and Gaussian assumption, what these previous computations do is essentially apply Bayes' theorem. There are myriad extensions of this to continuous time, nonlinear, non-Gaussian, distributed, networked, and I'll touch on a few of these things. Algorithm is real time, it's online, it's recursive. So it's really, really suited for implementation to a wide variety of systems. You saw all these matrix inverses and so forth. The enormous amount of work has been done, how to compute those efficiently. What do you do with these inverses? This P and Q, P is supposed to be positive definite. How do you ensure that? So there are things like square root algorithms that ensure positivity and make inversion easy. I cannot tell you how much work is there in all different aspects of theory and implementation of Kalman filtering. And as a result, there are applications in just a wide variety of fields in engineering, in sciences, physical sciences to behavioral sciences, all fields of engineering, and it shows up in many of the technological products. And I have to add, for this audience, applications in machine vision. And there is just voluminous literature around Kalman filtering. So there's a very rich heritage he has left behind for us that we can leverage. Let me now turn to multi-sensor data fusion. So the idea here, and this is again another field that's quite old, and I'll explain that in the rest of my talk. The idea here is, can we combine data from multiple disparate sensors to arrive at a unified estimate of the unknown system or unknown signal? So it really is a very kind of a concept, a general concept, and the main focus is you're looking at something with multiple different modalities of sensing. So electromagnetic, could be acoustic, any kind of imaging. You can just think of all different kind of sensing, but they are sensing the same system or same signal or same environment. How do you combine all those sensors to give you a unified best picture of what's going on? Because it's a fairly general idea, there is a wide variety of techniques to address disparate challenges related to system, to the sensors, and the data characteristics, because the data can have different kinds of granularity, accuracy, so on and so forth. And these techniques, you can sort of think of them as probabilistic. Dempster-Schaeffer theory has been proposed for multi-sensor data fusion. Fuzzy sets, random sets, all sorts of techniques have been proposed depending on the nature of the system and nature of the data and the nature of the sensors. And there are many application domains. I think a lot of impetus for sensor fusion came from the defense applications. So aerospace or naval applications, think of ships sensing their environment. I mean, you can just, you can let your imagination run and you can see where this sort of an idea would have application. In current day reality, sensor networks, IoT is creating a huge opportunity for multi-sensor data fusion. Things like digital twins, manufacturing, monitoring of systems. Again, you can see why the idea of multi-sensor data fusion would be very important. Robotics is another field, biomedical. Applications where you say imaging, for example, your multimodal imaging, how do you combine information from different types of sensing in biomedical applications. And then finally, I certainly want to say physical sciences. So you think remote sensing, weather prediction, there is a whole field called data assimilation. That's nothing but data fusion. So it's a very, very powerful idea. And again, as I said, it's a topic that's been around for quite some time, and there are some nice review papers. It turns out that Kalman filtering has a big role to play. And so here I'm just quoting from a review paper on multi-sensor data fusion, where the authors state, nonetheless, the Kalman filter is one of the most popular fusion methods, mainly due to its simplicity, ease of implementation, and optimality in a mean squared error sense. It is a very well-established data fusion method whose properties are deeply studied and examined both theoretically and in practical applications. And then he goes on to talk about weaknesses. On the other hand, similar to other least squares estimators, Kalman filter is very sensitive to data corrupted by outliers etc., etc. The main point is Kalman filter plays a very significant role in multi-sensor data fusion. And I explained to you the linear Gaussian version of the Kalman filter. There are many, many extensions that are relevant to, particularly to sensor data fusion. EKF, extended Kalman filter, is probably the simplest extension that applies to nonlinear system. And the idea here is you still characterize your state estimate and noise as Gaussian random variables. You still describe state error as a Gaussian random variable. You propagate the state estimate through the nonlinear system, and you calculate the output equation using the true nonlinear system. But all the covariances and so on and so forth, you propagate them through the linearization of the nonlinear system. Okay, so it's probably the simplest way to extend the theory to nonlinear systems. Then there is a version of this called uncentered Kalman filter, which is a little more complicated than EKF, but it tends to be much more accurate. It still uses Gaussian random variables to describe the state estimate and state estimate error and noise. But what it does is it takes a few selected points. So in EKF, you only look at the mean and covariance, and you just propagate the mean through the nonlinear system. Here, you actually look at a few points on the distribution, and they're very carefully chosen using something called the uncentered transformation. And you use those few points, you propagate them through the nonlinearity, you calculate the covariances and propagate the system that way. And that is, gives you much more accurate estimates compared to EKF. Then there is the whole body of literature on particle filters or Monte Carlo algorithms, which are, you can think of this like much more computation intensive versions of UKF, where you just select a whole bunch of points and propagate the entire distribution and calculate the properties of the distribution. I mean, a general result in nonlinear filtering is the best estimate is a conditional mean, except your distributions are no longer Gaussian, so you cannot characterize them simply. So particle filters kind of get over that, but they tend to be much more computationally expensive. And there are other related methods to Kalman filtering. One particular version that I think is potentially of interest for eye tracking and other applications is what is called multi-rate Kalman filtering. So here you imagine you have a bunch of sensors, except they are sensing at different sampling rates. That may be because of their bandwidth constraints or their physical characteristics. So you imagine a sensor one operating at sampling time n times t, and sensor two operating at sampling time m times t, where t is a common period. And n and m are two different integers. And you can imagine n different such sensors, each operating at a different time, different sampling rate. What do you do? Well, I mean, in principle, the Kalman filter equations generalize quite easily to this case, but the notation can get quite hairy. One generic approach to multi-rate filtering is what is called lifting. So let's start with, suppose you have a discrete time sequence Z0, Z1, Zn, etc. You pick an n and you stack these vectors. So here as n such samples, so 0 up to Zn minus 1 becomes a super vector Zn at time 0, and then Zn at 1 becomes the next n samples, and so on and so forth. And if you do that, you can convert using this is called lift. So you lift the sequence to this higher dimensional space, and you can just sort of rewrite all the equations, and a multi-rate system can then be rewritten as a standard discrete time system of the kind I started with, using this lifting idea. And then you can try and calculate all the variables you are interested in. There are many, many papers in control systems literature based on this lifting approach. This is just one of many. And the nice review paper that I have shown here, where there is an overview of multi-rate, multi-sensor systems. And here, as an example, they use something called the data block technique, which is not that dissimilar from the lifting technique, where you take blocks of data and process them and propagate your estimates. Moving on from multi-rate Kalman filtering, I want to talk about this distributed or decentralized Kalman filtering. So what if these sensors are distributed on a network perhaps, they are not all on the same physical location. What do you do then? Well, there is again quite a bit of history on this question. Some of the oldest papers go back to 1970s. I've shown some. Kalman filter algorithms or multi-sensor systems in 1976 IEEE CDC. And then another paper in the Transactions of Automatic Control in 1988 that had some of the earliest results on this. And you can see the different kind of architectures for the distributed or decentralized case. Where do the signals come? Where do they go? Where they are processed? And there is a lot of choice to be made here. And then there is application of this distributed filtering to sensor fusion, which is the topic that we've been focusing on in sensor networks. There's a very nice paper by Olfati Saber that I mentioned here that is definitely worth a read. And let me just now explain the key ideas behind this. Suppose you have J different sensors described by the output equations. Is the same process dynamics, except that you got J different outputs. Well, conceptually, this is not what you would actually do. Conceptually, what you could do is combine all the outputs into a single vector Y and apply Kalman filter. Okay, I mean, you can do this, and that would be your optimal estimate if you didn't have any constraints on the network or distributed sensing. What is done in this body of literature is you create local Kalman filter and fuse the results. So one sort of way of thinking about this is you create a Kalman filter at each sensor, generate state estimates and covariance matrices, and then combine these estimates. So there is a whole variety of algorithms for exchanging information between sensors with or without a central processor. So there are techniques where there is no central location. They're just talking to each other. That's all, peer-to-peer, as well as where you can combine results at a central computer. And there are analytical results on performance of the resulting estimates, convergence of the estimator, etc. And again, there is a huge body of literature. I've shown you a few already. So here is an example of the kind of algorithms that come about. And this is the old Hashemipour paper from the Transactions. And what it shows is how you combine both the estimate of the state as well as the covariances at different locations. So the first equation shows you calculate covariances, error covariances of the kind that we discussed for the Kalman filter at different sensor locations. And how do you put them together and propagate an estimate of the covariance? And then how do you propagate state estimates? So this second equation shows how you propagate the best state estimate from the local state estimates driving. So here you don't have to combine all the measurements. You simply propagate the covariances and then compute the state estimate. This is just one example of the kind of fusion that can be done, but there are many other examples. So Olfati Saber's paper that is more recent and talks about there being a sensor network. What you do is that each sensor node, you have two things, a covariance filter and a consensus filter. And you create what is called a micro Kalman filter that gives you a state estimate at that node. And then these nodes talk to each other according to the diagram shown to the right, where they exchange information with each other, described by the network connectivity. So which sensor can talk to who? And what Olfati Saber shows is how these types of algorithms can converge, assuming, assumptions would be like network is connected and things of that nature. Leads to results on the quality of the estimate and its convergence. Okay, now to my final part of the talk, which is what's the application to the kind of questions that are of interest to this workshop. So let me first begin by, again, repeat by saying that I really don't know a whole lot about eye tracking, but in preparation for this workshop, I did study the literature and then came across this wonderful paper by Greg Welch, who I suspect most of you know, on the history on the use of Kalman filter for human motion tracking in virtual reality. And in the paper, he says that one of the earliest published accounts, although this is not the earliest actual use because this was published in '88, is Rebo's master's thesis. And then so he goes over the entire history of the use of Kalman filtering. And then I just thought this quote from his conclusion section is particularly interesting. Information and associated databases will be organized by physical location and time, allowing users to both store and retrieve past, present, and future information in the context of physical locality and direction of gaze. The Kalman filter will undoubtedly play a role in this vision, no matter what the underlying source of signals. So I was really pleased to see that in this review paper, when it comes to conclusions, he says that Kalman filter, he expects Kalman filter to play a significant role. Now, putting this a little bit more current context, I mean, one of the both merits and difficulties with control theory world is it's very heavily based on dynamical math models. So all of control theory is sort of predicated on having mathematical models of the system that you are trying to either predict or control or what have you. And certainly Kalman filtering and quality. I mean, if your models are good, it can do an amazing job. If the models are not so good, then there is a problem. Now, the newer machine learning methods, like deep learning and all those types of techniques, avoid model building, and they simply rely on data and a generic neural network, for example, and some training algorithms or learning algorithms to solve similar problems. And so, one of the things that I think is of great interest is, can we combine the strengths of model-based approaches with these data-driven learning type of approaches. And there are some recent examples that show that there is probably merit to this idea. So this is a 2016 paper from Symposium on Mixed and Augmented Reality, Learning to Fuse. Again, I don't know these authors, but I imagine some of you do. And I thought this paper was very interesting, and it came up with what, it's really one of the really interesting ways of combining model-based and model-free approaches. So you have, and their problem is to combine two types of sensing. So it's sensor fusion, inertial sensor, camera sensor, and then you use an LSTM as well as the visual tracker, and you apply the Kalman filter to the output of an error detection system. And that calculates a final pose, and that is then fed back into the trained LSTM. And then the results show significant improvement in the performance of the resulting system. So the main idea for their work was, can combining these two sensing modalities using a mix of Kalman filtering and LSTM, and so you can see on this chart in the results a major improvement in, for example, the failed frames and overlap, both of these metrics. Eye tracking, again, there are many different issues in eye tracking. So there are issues involving eye movements. So there are different kinds of eye movements, fixation, saccades, and then smooth pursuits, especially following dynamic stimuli, like say in video. Pupil detection is a big part in eye tracking. And then the issues related to calibration, tracker calibration, slippage, or calibration drift. Now it turns out that for the movement problem, there is actually a rich body of literature where Kalman filter has played a big role. And I think it's probably one of the most pioneering papers in this goes back to Sauter et al. In 1991. This was for remote eye tracking, not the kind that you would use in virtual reality, but again, they applied Kalman filter for eye tracking movements. And then there is the really thesis of high impact thesis of Grindinger on eye movement using Kalman filter, and then a much more recent paper by Komogortsev and Javid Khan on Kalman filtering for eye gaze guided computer interfaces, where they make, in fact, in that paper, they make math models and apply Kalman filter for their eye gaze problem. There have been publications in the control theory literature on this. So this is actually a 2002 paper, a non-intrusive Kalman filter-based tracker for pursuit eye movement. So that's a dynamic pursuit eye movement. And I thought I would just show you a result from their work. This is in American Control Conference, so not the kind of conference that your group might go to. And again, that shows on the right-hand side, the result from an application of a Kalman filter against the true eye position. And on the left-hand side is a test sequence that simulates. So you can see that it does a very good job of reducing error and smoothing the estimate. My final point is I believe that control theory has the potential to provide useful tools. And here I picked a very recent paper by one of the leading groups in eye tracking. It's called Get a Grip. It was at the last year's ETRA. And there is a quote, and this is the paper that makes the case that the major remaining challenge in eye tracking for virtual reality, augmented reality is device slippage, which leads to calibration errors. And so this is kind of a sensor drift type of problem. Again, I don't know all the details of this, but the question of sensor drift and can you automatically have sensor drift, it has some old history. And in fact, this is where I thought I would just show one of my own papers where I worked on a similar problem, but again, a very different context. It was for semiconductor manufacturing. And we came up with a technique which could deal with sensor drift in real time as the process was happening, and it can self-correct. So it isn't complete self-calibration, because I think that's the way one could go to avoid some of this calibration and slippage problem is, can you have a completely self-calibrating system? This is a step in that direction. And the idea was relatively simple. We modeled the sensor drift via a state variable. And so it became a nonlinear Kalman filtering problem to which we came up with a solution and actually proved properties of its error characteristics and so forth. And so this is just an example. Again, I don't know how applicable it is going to be, but there is this whole body of literature in control world that I think has the potential to be useful for eye tracking. So to conclude, there is a rich body of literature on Kalman filtering and myriad extensions. There is a rich body of literature on multi-rate, multi-sensor fusion. I think combining machine learning techniques and some of these techniques from Kalman filtering world, I think has potential, as shown you one example of that. And then there is potential for solving current contemporary problems in eye tracking by leveraging this body of knowledge. So with that, I thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Professor Karganikar, for this wonderful talk. I would like to open the floor now for questions. And so you can use the Q&A chat box or chat to post your questions. I'll read them out. And I see that Dr. Karganikar has been answering some of the questions already through chat, but yeah. So yeah, I see a question from Rob Cavan. So he say, I'm unable to ask the question in Q&A. So I'll ask in the forum. Dr. Pramod, you point out that Kalman filters work less well for process where the model or process noise aren't well understood, but there are some papers that do attempt analytical models. Is there a way to evaluate how these models match reality using Kalman filters? Follow-up question, what procedures would you suggest to characterize process models, process noise for biological processes like eye movement, analytical models for eye tracking? Is Dr. Karganikar here? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Karganikar.
Can I just speak?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Okay, because I was typing my answers. Anyhow, I think, Rob, that's a great question, not easy to answer in a short blurb. I would say, there are a few things I can suggest. One is to collect experimental data and use a model validation type of techniques. There is a body of literature on model validation in the systems literature. And if you had data, you can compare models against that data. Another way I can imagine addressing your question is you use the model, build the filter, and if you had access to a truth sensor that was independent of the sensor you're using for sort of real-time estimation. So you imagine that there are very high fidelity sensor you have access to. Then you can compare your estimate against that high fidelity sensor. So depend on the specifics of what's available in terms of data and measurements and sensing. And then I think there are techniques that we can bring to bear. So if you have something more specific in mind, just email me and I'll try and see if I can, at least point you in the right direction. But this is an important question that comes up everywhere.
Great. So yeah, we have a few more minutes for a few more questions, if there are any. So maybe I'll ask one. So Dr. Khagankar, in your talk, you sort of highlighted this new direction of work where there are benefits to merge data-driven approaches like machine learning with model-driven approaches. I'm curious. I mean, this is a very interesting framework in general, but have you seen any real-world examples where such a framework is actually used in applications? Just curious.
I mean, I think I would say in applications where, say, control theory has been traditionally used, and I can imagine robotics as a great example of that, right? Where traditionally control theory has been used for lower level control. So imagine a robotics problem where you might be moving an arm, where there is this very classical control problem, lot of that. And now you combine that, say, with a vision sensor where you might use a machine learning approach. And so there are, I think, those types of things where the combination is relatively straightforward because you have essentially two, they're not quite decoupled problems, but they're more or less decoupled problems because there is a lower level problem that you're solving using classical approaches from control theory. And then there are these more learning type of higher level inference of, say, the environment and that kind of a thing that you can say use deep learning for. I think where the real state of the art, it seems to me, is going and should be going is areas where you take, say, a machine learning approach, which completely sort of eliminates models, and take some parts of it and combine it with parts of the physical system where the models can be built or exist, where you can apply model-based approaches like Kalman filter, for example, and then come up with a judicious combination. I think this is where I think potentially breakthroughs are possible. And I think that's at the beginning.
Thanks, Dr. Khagankar. So we have a comment, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see a question in. Oh, maybe there's a question in there. Can KF variants apply to cases with switching dynamics?
Yes. Short answer, yes. Because like I said, I mean, the problems with switching systems have been studied in at least my world since the mid-90s, if not earlier. And again, if you are interested specifically, email me and I can at least point you to the key papers or the key researchers who have done work in that area. I myself have written some papers on switching systems. So yeah, the short answer to that question is yes.
Great. So yeah, I think we are out of time, and thank you, Dr. Khagankar, again.
So Sachin, let me just close by saying, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak here. And then I welcome any members in the audience who would like to connect with me. The easiest way is to email me, and I try to respond to emails as quickly as I can, and I welcome that. One reason I think this turned out to be a very interesting experience for me is I learned a lot about eye tracking. This is still, I've scratched the surface of what you all know, but I felt like, oh, I learned a new area. And so maybe what I know, I can connect with people from your world and see if some good can happen. So thank you, and really enjoyed this interaction.
Thank you, Dr. Khagankar. Appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Okay, bye.
So with that, I would like to invite Dr. Oleg Komogortsev to speak about our next speakers in the roster. Oleg.
Can you hear me, guys? Yep.
Yes.
So I would like to introduce Professor Iti, who is Professor of Computer Science, Psychology, Neuroscience at the University of Southern California. He has done a lot of work in visual attention, scene understanding, control of eye movements, and what is interesting to me, health assessments based on saliency and eye movements. And I met Laurent for the first time in 2006 when him and his students won the Best Paper Award at Eye Tracking Research and Application Symposium. And I remember myself sitting with his student, Ren Karmi, and arguing how it is better to predict future eye movements based on saliency and the oppositional signal. So for me, Laurent have a special place in my heart. So, and with this, Laurent, you're welcome to talk.
Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I would like to first of all thank Oleg for his kind invitation to this workshop. So today I'm going to try to convince you that trying to understand in computational terms how visual attention works is going to be very important for the development of compelling experiences for virtual reality. To get us started, these are eye movement recordings. We have here 12 people. There are 6 males in blue and 6 females in red. And what we can see is that often there is quite a bit of spread in the kind of locations that they're interested in. Even so, sometimes everybody agrees on one particular location. So what this tells us is that there is probably some kind of common ground that we can find between people, but there will be also some individual differences. So why is this important for virtual reality? Well, in VR, you have the possibility of looking anywhere you want, and again, to try to create a compelling experience, it will be very important to try to achieve shared attention or a match on attention between what the content creator had in mind and what the user of the experience is actually going to experience. So this brings us to this idea of how can we try to understand how people find interesting or important or relevant information under time constraints. If you think about this, in principle, this is a very complex task. Is it that I need to attend to all the objects that are in the scene and then recognize each attended object in turn and finally evaluate the set of recorded objects against my goals? In practice, if I was to do that, I would be dead before I find a predator or a mate or some food. So there is evolutionary pressure to develop some simple heuristics or approximations that will guide attention towards that interesting or more important information. I will today tell you about 2 types of such heuristics that we have studied in the lab. One is bottom-up attention. How is it that we are guided towards salient or conspicuous locations in some kind of reflexive manner? And the other is top-down attention, which happens when we are trying to achieve a task and then try to focus our attention on the more behaviorally or task-relevant goals. So this is a simple model that we developed over the years for bottom-up attention. Here in the top left corner, you can see an input image, which is then processed through a number of visual channels, which we believe replicate what is happening in the early stages of visual processing in primates. At the end of this processing, information is combined into a single topographic salience map that is shown here at the bottom left. And this map simply highlights those locations that are more likely to attract the attention of the viewer. So you can see, for example, that there is a little hotspot in that map that corresponds to the bag of money in the original image. So with this kind of simple computational model, we can then present it a number of pictures that it has never seen before. And here the little yellow circles shows you the top 2 or 3 most interesting locations for this model. And you can see that often it tends to look at objects or persons or animals that we would expect should also attract the attention of a human viewer. So this brings us back to this idea of building a quick heuristic. This model doesn't understand much about the scenes, but is still able to make a reasonable prediction of where the most important elements might be in that scene. So, however, this is just the beginning, and in real life, we are often engaged in some tasks, and we don't want to just look at things that are popping out in the visual environment, but we also want to look at those locations that will help us achieve the task. So these are some older examples that I'm sure you are all familiar with, in which eye movements were recorded while people were doing different kinds of tasks, like observing a painting or arranging some colored blocks, making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and so on. So in my lab, we have taken this further by looking at interactive video games. So here, a player is driving a car, and in this game, they have to follow the rules of the road very strictly. And you can see the eye movement position that is being recorded from the player, which is that little cyan square. Here is another example, and I'll show you some results with this one, where you are basically running a hot dog stand in New York City, and you have customers that are going to come and place their orders. You have to manage the grill, make sure your sausages are cooked but not burnt, and assemble the sandwiches, and so on. So this is quite a complex task, and as you can see, the eye, and so the eye is still the little cyan square here, and the mouse, which is the little gray square, are moving in highly non-random manner as a human player is performing this task. Indeed, if you just look at the raw data, so this is just as a function of time on the horizontal axis, where did people look at? And you can see that at the beginning, the player is focusing on number 11 here, the raw sausage, then alternating between number 10, sausage cooked, and the number 15, the hot dog pool, and so on, right? So clearly, the behavior is far from being random, and there is clear structure into how people approach this kind of task that is given to them. So how can we capture this in a model? In general, we are interested in trying to predict what is the probability that attention will go to a particular location next, given the mental state of the user. So of course, the mental state is something that we cannot directly measure. So what we are going to do in this work is try to infer it from the sequence of previous fixations. And so we are building, in this particular work, we are building a dynamic Bayesian model, which is going to take into account what is the sequence of all the objects that have been visited so far, all the things that the player has already looked at, and from that try to make an inference as to where they are going to look next. So we hope that this model basically can capture some simple contingencies, that if you have already looked at the sausage, for example, then the next thing that you should look at is the hot dog bun, or maybe have a look at a customer, and so on. So I'm going to skip all of the mathematical details and just show you some results here. So if you first look at the top left, this is just the original frames of one particular run of this game, and the eye position recorded from the player is that little red circle. You can then look at panel number 9, which is the model that I just showed you. And here we are just showing you the recorded eye position, still that little red marker, and also the prediction of the model, where the model thinks the player should be looking at that particular point in time. And again, this is based on the analysis of where the player has looked at so far, and then trying to make the predictions for the next time point. So if you thought that you had free will in this kind of game, you can see that on panel 9, the blue and the red are overlapping for a vast majority of the time. And so that means that indeed the model was successful in capturing those contingencies that relate, what you have looked at so far and where you should be looking, next. To try to go a little bit deeper into this, we have started looking at things that are getting closer now to virtual reality environments, even so this one is still on regular 2D screen, which are immersive video games. And so in this one, what we are going to try to do is not only try to predict the next location of attention and the next eye position, but try to predict the current state of the user and which action the user is going to do next. So here you can see that the user just shot an airplane, and let's see whether we can actually predict when those events occur based on an analysis of the eye movements up to time t, and then predict whether one of those events is going to occur in the near future. So the way in which we are going to do this is, first we record when those events occur. So here, each time that little broken line goes up, that means that a target was destroyed during that particular run of the game. And we are going to consider plus or minus 5 seconds around each of those events, and then collapse all of the data aligned on the time of the event. Around each event, we are going to look not only at the video frames, but we are also going to take them to process them through the models, and hence compute over those frames both the bottom-up prediction from the saliency model and also top-down predictions from that Bayesian model that I showed you previously. Once we have those two, we are going to now consider the eye movements of the player, and in real time we are going to record how much agreement there is between the eye position of the player and the prediction of those two different models. So here is the result, again taking all of those events and lining them up on time 0 when the target destroyed occurred. And you can see that what we observe here is, if we look on the vertical axis, this is NSS, which is a normalized scan-sparse salience score. The actual score is not so important as the pattern that we observe. So you can see that for that particular event, maybe 1 or 2 seconds before the actual event, there is a sharp increase in the agreement between the eye position of the player and the bottom-up model, and conversely a decrease in the agreement with the top-down model. So what we can do based on this is now basically build a classifier in which we are going to look for those shapes of in the agreement curves between the bottom-up and the top-down model. And if we apply this, let me skip that, this is just another event just to show you a different shape. If we apply this, we can then detect those events, and again we are going to detect them usually about 1 or 2 seconds before they actually occur. Okay, and here you can see the performance, which is pretty good if we use both the behavior and the stimulus. We get slightly worse performance if we only use the eye movements, so not analyzing the video at all, but just trying to build a classifier just based on the pattern of eye movements that people are making. And likewise, we get a worse performance if we only use the stimulus alone and we don't use the eye movements. So basically what this tells us is that by recording eye movements and applying computational models to analyze the eye movements over time, we are able to get some insight as to what the current mental state, or the current progression in the task for the user is, and possibly what their next action is going to be. So this, I believe, is very important for virtual reality applications, as it can give you some insight as to what your user is currently doing and what they are planning to do next. Here is just to show you an example with a different kind of game. Basically the same idea. In this case, we are looking at events where the player is going to start speeding up, and we can find again a different pattern. The classifier is not as good here, but still significantly above chance. So I would like to add one more facet to this, which has to do with how can we make sure that those models actually represent what we believe is happening in the human brain. So to try to validate the model, what we have done recently is to look at the different brain areas that are shown in this little diagram, and see whether we could establish a direct correlation between what the model predicts and neural activity in one of those areas. And the target area that we decided to use is the supercolliculus, marked SC here in that little beige rectangle, because of its particular location and its particular pattern of connection with the other with the other structures in the brain. So the colliculus, first of all, receives direct input from the retina, also additional inputs from visual cortex. And most importantly, it is directly connected to the brainstem that will then activate the eye muscles. So it is kind of a hub that fuses visual inputs and then produces the motor behavior to actually activate the eye movements. We are not the first ones to look at this. Here is an example of a previous paper in which the group of John Delan Haynes used fMRI to try to look at whether there would be correlation between patterns of activations in the human brain and saliency as predicted by our model. And they found several areas of significant correlation, which are the usual suspects, the frontal ice field and the posterior and anterior intraparietal sulci. Here, however, what we wanted to do was to see whether we could directly put electrodes in the superior colliculus, and so we are not going to do that in humans, but we are going to do that in monkeys that have very similar brain structure as we do, and see whether we could have a more direct correlation between the firing of a single neuron and the activity as predicted by the saliency model. So this is work with Doug Munoz group in Canada. So here is the basic setup. We are going to have monkeys watch videos like this. So this is like BBC Planet Earth and this kind of videos. And the current eye position of the monkey is that little square. And the receptive field, or the part of the visual space that the neuron under study is sensitive to, is shown by this circle. And so those neurons, they have so-called retinotopic receptive fields, so their region of sensitivity moves as the eye is moving over the visual scene. We can then, first of all, transform the visual input into superior colliculus space, which is highly distorted. It's a little bit the same idea as you may know that your retina has very high resolution towards the center of gaze, but much lower resolution in the periphery. The same phenomenon happens and is actually emphasized in the superior colliculus, where there is over-representation of the central part of the visual field and a much coarser representation of the periphery. Once we have this representation, we can then compute the salience map in real time over those transformed video frames, and we are now ready to do our direct correlation. So whenever the saliency from the model is high inside the circle that corresponds to the receptive field of the neuron, we are going to test, is the neuron going to fire more strongly at those points in time. So here the electrodes go in the colliculus, and here is the basic result. I'm just going to give you a very brief summary of this for today. So the main result is that it worked exactly as expected. So here, if we line up all the fixations, so time 0 represents the onset of every new fixation at a particular location on the scene. And we are going to use the model to compute the salience in the receptive field of the neuron during that fixation. And so this gives rise to those three curves that are basically three tertiles of salience level. So the high, medium, and low salience gives us the thickness of the lines of the three curves. Okay. Then we are going to measure for each of those tertiles what was the actual activation of the neuron that we recorded from. And indeed, again, as expected, we find that when the model predicted that the salience inside the receptive field of the neuron is currently low, then the activation that we recorded, so the number of spikes per second that we recorded from the neuron, was indeed low. And conversely, when the model predicted a high salience, which is the sick curve, then the neuron also fired much more vigorously. So this gives us, for the first time, a direct empirical validation of these kind of models that I've shown you today. In that, basically, we have a direct correlation between model predicted salience and the firing of individual neurons in the monkey brain. So as I said, there is a lot more depth to this study, but I'm going to skip this for today, and I'm ready to answer any questions that you may have after this. I would like instead to spend the remaining few minutes to tell you about one last aspect of this, which is now not only looking at instantaneous attention, where am I going to look next, what is attracting my gaze, also going beyond those short-term events, am I going to pull the trigger in the next couple of seconds, and so on. Now looking at also using these kind of models to detect long-term traits. And so the basic hypothesis here is that if, again, we go back to this circuit of brain regions that processes visual input and eventually gives rise to eye movements, we can see that this is a heavily interconnected circuit. And so we hypothesize that if there is anything going wrong in any of those brain regions, that should give rise to a decipherable signature in your patterns of eye movements. So the way in which we tested this was to look at now patient populations. So here we have 3 groups of individuals. They are control children in blue, children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, in red, and children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in green. So ADHD and FASD are very interesting disorders because they are very poorly understood. And right now there is no simple gold standard or simple blood test that you can do to diagnose those. And often they are being confused by the clinicians, even so the treatment for those 2 diseases should be totally different. Let me skip this. So the methods here are going to be quite simple. It's very similar to what I've shown you so far. We are going to record eye movements while the participants simply watch a few minutes of videos. And we are then going to compute 3 different types of features. So we are first going to use a saliency model to compute saliency maps, and here we break it down for the different channels that contribute to saliency, color, intensity, orientation, and so on. So that will give rise to a first set of features, which is going to be based on the agreement between the eye movements of the observer and the predictions of these models. We are then going to look at the second set of features in addition to this, which are simple oculomotor features. So just looking at histograms of saccade amplitude, so how big of eye movements that this person typically make, how fast is the eye moving, how long the saccades last, what is the intersaccadic interval, so how long their fixations are lasting. And finally, we are going to look at a third type of features, which is comparison with a group of young adult control observers. So here the heat map that you see is built from a dozen USC students. We recorded their eye movements, and then we just paint a little Gaussian blob at the location where they are looking. And so here we can now measure the similarity between the current participant under test, which is the little red dot. We can ask, is that person looking at the same locations as this group of typical students we're looking at. So we further break down the features. So from those 3 types, oculomotor, saliency, and group-based features, we can further break it down into the sub-features, and then we further break that down into different points in time. So looking at the first saccade after each transition from one scene to another, and the second saccade, and so on. And finally, we can develop a classifier to try to then see whether there is enough information in the eye movement recording and in this joint analysis of the video and the eye movements to actually make a difference between the groups. So I'm going to show you first with the children, and then also we'll look at Parkinson's disease in elderly patients. So in children, it worked quite well. So overall, the accuracy at the 3-way classification, ADHD, FASD, or control, was about 77%, which is way above chance. That would be 40% in this case. And more importantly, what we can do now is ask which kind of feature was different in each of those diseases. And we can here do it just for the three groups, oculomotor, saliency, and group, or we can further break it down into the individual features that we used. And so the important message here is that you can see that for each disease, for example, in this case, ADHD, has a very different signature, and the signature here is based on the solid dots. Those are the ones that are significantly different in ADHD versus control. And if we compare this profile to the one that we obtained for FASD, you can see that it's a very different signature. So for the first time here, we have a completely objective and completely quantitative way of estimating this long-term trait of our participants, in this case, whether they have some kind of neurological condition. So the results for Parkinson's at completely the other end of the age spectrum are similar. It actually worked even better here, almost 90% correct. And again, a completely different signature for those individuals compared to ADHD or FASD. More recently, we are now looking at this in conjunction with other techniques, so other eye movement measures, also looking at diffusion tensor imaging in MRI, and basically using all of those measures to try to build a decision tree that would help the clinician in deciding whether a person has one of those conditions. And so we can start with, for example, doing 5 minutes of eye movements and maybe a little structured eye movement task, and then based on those results decide whether we want to run more tests and so on. So I hope that in this talk, even so I have never really worked with any direct application to virtual reality, this is actually something that we are starting now with Jessica Brilhart, who provided this video. And we quickly realized that if we are trying to convey a message in virtual reality where people have the freedom to look anywhere they want, really trying to understand how attention works and trying to predict where people are going to look at and trying to predict what is going to engage them is the key in trying to create an effective immersive experience. So with this, I would like to just give you a brief summary. So I've shown you a number of different models that are trying to address the problem of how can we understand visual attention. As I said, this is a hard problem, and especially when you are trying to look at task-driven attention, because different tasks give rise to different behaviors, and so the models have to be able to take that into account. We not only develop the models, but I've also shown you how we can validate them directly against, in our case, single unit recordings in monkeys, and how those models can be used not only to make predictions of eye movements, but also to make short-term predictions of the internal state of the user and their intentions and their future actions, for example, pulling the trigger or speeding up and so on. And in addition, can also be used to predict longer-term traits of the participants. For example, if they have a neurological disorder, but probably the same kind of classifier could be developed to predict their overall preferences or their overall orientations in various dimensions. So with this, I would like to thank the people who did the actual work, all of my students and collaborators, and of course to acknowledge our funding sources. And I will be available now to take any question that you have. Thank you.
Oleg, do you want to open the floor for questions?
Yes. So the first question was asked by Kimar Green. So in the healthy population that you have recorded, did you do some screening, or are you doing regular screening for people with some abnormalities or brain diseases to make sure that the signal, when you work with the saliency maps and your estimation that you're working with the normals, you're basically screening for any abnormal cases?
Yes, so can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Yes, so so far, the application that we have done with the patient populations were patients that were referred to us by clinicians. So they had already a somewhat confirmed diagnosis, and we were basically at the stage where we want to see whether we can, whether our models agree with this diagnosis or not. So I guess the question relates to, the next step to this would be to take just a random sample of the population, people who don't yet have anything or who have not yet been diagnosed. So we haven't done that yet, but indeed that's the next step. This, of course, is going to take some time, right? So ideally, you would set that up as a 5-year or 10-year study in which you just run a very large sample, and then you wait for a few years and see who is going to develop a confirmed diagnosis and whether the model was able to predict that earlier than the conventional methods. So we don't have those results yet, but so far what we have is a confirmation that for the cases that the clinicians are suspecting, then we can confirm those with those methods.
Okay, great, thank you so much. And another question comes from Sachin Talafi, and so he is asking how data quality. So as we know, in the eye tracking world, each sensor that we are employing, or basically each eye tracker, has its own way how it works with people. So data quality that you're getting can be different. Did you try to investigate the impact of data quality that you're getting from eye tracker on your prediction outcomes?
Yes, somewhat. So the eye tracker that we have been using so far is an expensive one. It's an iLink 1000, so I think it's like on the order of $50,000, something like that. And the main reason for this is that it has a sampling rate of a kilohertz. So we get a lot of details on the actual shape of the saccades and these kind of things. However, one thing that we tried was to just downsample the data, so to simulate, what would happen if we had only an eye tracker with 100 hertz, a sampling rate. And actually, we ended up using this for most of the analysis because the kilohertz sampling rate is not really necessary for this analysis, and so a lower sampling rate works just as well. And we didn't see any significant difference in that. Now, in terms of calibration and drift and this kind of thing, so this is always a problem, of course, with eye tracking. So far, what we are doing is we are showing the video in like short segments of maybe 1 minute, and then we show a fixation for a few seconds. And so this allows us to just do drift correction on that fixation, and also to drop any person that is outside of the screen for too long, and that is untrackable, and so on. So far this has been sufficient for us. We are now actually recording eye movements from babies that are just 2 months old, and we can't hold their head or anything, so they are just sitting in their mom's lap, and the camera is just looking at their eyes, but it seems to be working just fine. So for us, again, with the iLink, which has some level of built-in head tracking and correction for head motions and these kind of things, this has been working accurately. Yes.
Okay, great. Sachin, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, I think we can do one more. Sure.
Okay, so we'll try to read actually from the chat. So different machine learning-based attention mechanisms, including multimodal and intramodal, have been exploited to enhance the reasoning abilities for neural networks. Although the attention is generally believed to be very useful for improving the performance for multiple computer vision tasks, there is some research work to show that the attention mechanism of current neural networks, usually achieved by simple matrix operation between feature embedding, is different from the actual human attention, which is more complex and sophisticated. Specifically, human visual attention and obtained machine attention sometimes focus on different parts of the image. So my question is, from a high-level perspective, do you think that the actual human attention should be pursued or supervision for the machine-based attention mechanisms in the future?
That's great. I think it should be supervision. So this question is basically referring to people trying to add attention mechanisms to deep learning models. And I would agree with the statement, which is basically to say that, well, you are trying to add an attention mechanism so that it will help you select the most appropriate features for a particular task or at a particular point in time and so on. So the approach that we have taken in my lab, even so I have some students who are also doing this now, because I mean, we cannot avoid doing any deep learning these days. But the approach that we have taken was actually quite different originally, which was to look more at the neuroscience literature and to try to build the models so that they would, first agree with the eye movements of human participants. And so I would agree that, I believe those models are very different than an attention model that is basically an add-on to a deep network, and that is basically going to be trained to solve a specific attention task, but which may not be the same as what our brain has evolved to do. So an example of this is that if you build a classifier that is going to be trained on ImageNet, and you are trying to put an attention mechanism here, the only thing that this classifier is ever exposed to is ImageNet, right? But evolutionarily, our brain not only has evolved to classify images, but also to detect predators and to do motion pursuit and all kinds of other tasks. And that may have indeed significantly shaped, how attention is being formulated in our brains as opposed to in those models. So yeah, I would be on the side that you may want to, first try to study attention in a broad range of conditions, and then use one of those models to enhance your deep learning model, as opposed to trying to do end-to-end, which is, very, it's a very compelling thing, to have like a single model that you are going to train end-to-end, and that includes an attention mechanism that will be trained on the fly and so on. But indeed, you may end up with a more specific or more specialized attention mechanism than what has actually evolved in our brains.
Thank you very much.
Cool, great. So yeah, I think next speaker is Quinji and Zukong. You are going to introduce? Yeah, cool.
Thanks for the nice talk.
Thank you.
Okay, for the next talk, I'm glad to introduce Professor Qiang Ji, who is from the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, as our next invited speaker. Professor Ji received his PhD degree from the University of Washington, and he was assistant professor at the University Nevada at Reno. He also held research and visiting position at UIUC, CMU, and the U.S. Air Force Research Lab. Professor Ji also is a fellow IEEE and IPR. If you are doing gaze estimation research, you can't miss his work. And I'm looking forward to his talk, and let's play the video.
First, I would like to thank the workshop organizer to invite me to give the talk. The title of my talk is a Bayesian approach for robust and generalizable eye tracking. As we know, the goal of eye tracking is to identify a person's focus of attention, which is represented as the visual access in the 3D space and as a point of regard in 2D space. Eye tracking has many applications, including marketing, psychology, user behavior research, gaming, human-computer interaction, and medical diagnosis. For example, when we apply eye tracking to reading, we can understand readers' reading habits, and we can use eye tracking to improve readers' reading comprehension and to improve the layout of the reading materials. Eye tracking can also be applied to marketing to understand customers' interest in products and to understand their purchase decision. Eye tracking can also be applied to game, where eye movement can be used as additional inputs to control and navigate the game. Many different video-based eye tracking techniques have been developed over the years, and one of the approaches is the model-based eye tracking. The basic idea of model-based eye tracking is to use a geometrical model that captures the anatomical structure of the eye to analytically estimate the eye gaze from eye images. It starts with the eye landmark detection. So for example, it detects the landmarks on the eyelids, landmarks on the iris, and the center of the pupil. Recently, additional landmarks, face landmarks, are also being used. For example, we can use landmarks near the nose, landmark in the center of the two eyes, and the landmarks on the eyebrows. Once we have these landmarks, we can feed them into the geometrical eye model, and then we can analytically compute the center of the eyeball and the center of the pupil. And connecting the center of the eyeball and the center of the pupil, that gives us the optical access. Then through a personal calibration, we'll be able to obtain the visual access. The benefits of model-based eye tracking is that it can generalize well to different subjects, and it allows natural head movement, and it does not require any training data. However, model-based eye tracking is highly sensitive to the errors with eye landmark detection. Any perturbation or inaccuracy with eye landmark or facial landmark detection could lead to significant eye gaze estimation error. So the goal of this research is to overcome the limitation with existing model-based approach while retaining its strengths. Specifically, we propose a novel approach that combines model-based eye tracking with a Bayesian convolution neural network to achieve robust and generalizable eye tracking without explicit eye landmark detection, without explicit model fitting, and even without any ground truth gaze annotation. And this is an overview of our approach. We are given training data. So each training sample includes one eye image or face image and the corresponding landmarks. We have a total for n training samples. We are also given the parameter alpha, which is a hyperparameter that specifies the prior distribution of the Bayesian convolution neural network. And we are also given theta, which is the parameter for the geometrical eye model. So given this information, our goal is to estimate the gaze G and its uncertainty sigma T. This is the covariance matrix for a testing image IT. And this is the overall flow chart for the proposed method. So the input is a testing image. We are given the training data, and we are also given the hyperparameters that specify the prior distribution of W, where W is the parameter of the Bayesian convolution neural network. And then through a Bayesian inference, we will be able to obtain the probability of PZ given the landmark probability of PZ given the input image, given the training data, and given the hyperparameter alpha. And then we can fit this into the geometrical eye model, which is parameterized by theta, to generate PG given IT, given theta, given D, given alpha. Once we have this probability, then we can maximize this probability to obtain G star T, which is the estimated gaze. And we can also compute the covariance matrix from this probability that to quantify the uncertainty of the estimated gaze. So as you can see, the key for our approach is to compute this probability. So now let me show you how to compute this probability. So you can see in this probability, it is the probability of the gaze given the input image, given the training data, given the eye geometric model parameter theta, and given the hyperparameter alpha. It does not include landmarks, right? It does not include the parameter for the Bayesian neural network. So that's why we said that we can perform gaze estimation without explicit landmark detection, without explicit model training. However, to compute this probability, we need to first introduce landmarks. So this, why this equation can be rewritten in this format, the joint probability of gaze and the landmarks. But in order to make sure these two equations equal, we have to integrate out the landmarks, right? So this basically tells us that instead of using a single set of landmarks, we're going to try many different possible landmarks through this integration, right? So this is the key equation. Instead of doing maximization, we are doing modularization. Okay, this probability can be decomposed into two probabilities. One is the PGT given ZT, and the other is the PZT given IT given D given alpha. And this is the probability related to the geometric I model. And this is the probability that we can derive from the Bayesian convolution neural network. So we're going to talk about this later. So now this probability, okay? And this probability, in order to compute this probability, we have to introduce the parameter W for the Bayesian convolution neural network. So we introduce this W here, we compute the joint probability. But in order to make sure these two probability equal, then we have to integrate out W, right? So we introduce another integration over W. And then this probability is going to be equal to this probability. So this is again to show you that instead of obtain a point estimation of the Bayesian neural network parameter W, we are going to try different W by this integration. And this is another modularization instead of maximization. And once we have this probability, then by applying the conditional chain rule, we can decompose this probability into two probabilities. This is called the likelihood. Right. And then this is the probability, which is the key equation for Bayesian convolution neural network. This is the posterior distribution of the Bayesian neural network parameter given the training data D and given the hyperparameter alpha. As you can see that in this Bayesian approach, the parameter of Bayesian neural network is not treated as a parameter. They are treated as random variables. So now I will show you how to compute this each of these probability. First, let's start this one. So this one basically is the I model, right? So this is probability is related to the geometric model-based eye tracking. So now let's first look at the model-based eye tracking. So the model-based eye tracking, as we said before, is that we are first going to obtain the landmarks, right? The landmarks, the facial landmarks or eye landmarks. Once we have the landmarks, then we can analytically compute the center of the eyeball and the center of the pupil in 3D. And then we connect them, this gives us the optical axis. And then through a personal calibration, assuming we have the Karpar angle, then we will be able to convert the optical axis to this visual axis. So this visual axis is basically the line of sight, right? So this basically says if we have the landmarks, right? If we have the landmarks and if we are also given the parameter theta, which including the eyeball radius and the Karpar angles, then we'll be able to analytically compute the gaze using the model-based method. So this we can generically we can write this as this. So GT equals to H ZT theta. H is the methods that we can use to convert to compute GT from ZT and theta. Right. So this is H varies depending on the specific model-based method. So this gives us the relationship between the GT and the ZT. This is the deterministic equation. However, we are interested in this probability, PGT given ZT given theta. And now we are going to assume that this one probability follows a Gaussian distribution, multivariate Gaussian distribution, with a mean which is determined by this function, and a covariance matrix sigma h. This covariance matrix basically captures the precision of the specific model-based method, and it is a function of the input ZT as well as the nature of the model-based method. And this sigma h can be computed offline, or we can use an average sigma h for different model-based method. So here we assume sigma h is given and theta is given. So this probability is fully specified. And then we need to compute this probability. So this is the posterior probability of the Bayesian network parameter given the training data and given the alpha. And by applying the Bayes rule, we can say this one is proportional to the product of the prior probability of W times the likelihood of W given the training data. And the likelihood of WD can be written as the product of the likelihood for each training sample, because we assume the training sample are IID. Then the joint likelihood can be written as the product of likelihood for each training sample. So now let's first look how we compute this term. So the prior probability distribution of alpha of W. So we follow the convention in Bayesian deep learning. we assume it is basically it's a standard scaled Gaussian distribution with a mean 0 and a scaled scalar sigma square times the identity matrix. Basically, we assume that each parameter of the Bayesian neural network is independent of each other, and they have a mean 0 and have a same variance sigma square. So this sigma is the hyperparameter, and typically it's a small value. For this study, we set it to 1. So now this is fully specified. Now we need to look at this probability. This is likelihood. So the likelihood here, this is basically like the output of the Bayesian neural network, right? So given the input image, and this is the distribution of the landmarks, and given the parameter of the Bayesian neural network, we want to compute the distribution of the landmarks. And we again assume this distribution follows a Gaussian distribution with the mean, and the covariance matrix. And this probability can be implemented using a probabilistic convolution neural network, where we have an input image, this eye image or face image, right? The output are two parameters. One is the parameter of the mean, right? The other for this the Gaussian distribution. Another is the diagonal element of the covariance matrix. So we assume this covariance matrix contains only the diagonal elements. The off-diagonal elements are all 0. So given these two set of parameters, then we'll be able to fully specify the conditional probability of P of Z given I given W, right? So this is how we produce this probability. So now we have the three probabilities. We can go back to this equation to solve this probability. But then we realize in order to solve this probability, we have to perform the two integrations. One is integration over the landmarks, another integration over the parameters of a Bayesian convolution neural network. This integration is very intractable computationally because the number of the parameter can be very large, hundreds, thousands, even millions of parameters, and they are dependent on each other. So there's no way that we can analytically solve this integration, right? So what we propose to do is we're going to sample. We propose this approximate. We're going to sample, then using the sample average to approximate the integration. So we're going to sample W from this posterior distribution. So this Wi is one sample that's sampled from this posterior distribution of W. And once we have the sample, let's say we sample M, right? We get M Wi. And then we can sum them together divided by the total number of samples. So this gives us a sample average. So this sample average is used to approximate this first integration. So now the key issue is how can we sample efficiently, because the number of parameters is very large. We cannot use the conventional method to sample. So we use the Monte Carlo MC method. But the traditional MC method is not efficient. So what we do here is we use this, what we call, this is the stochastic gradient Hamilton Monte Carlo method. This method is much more efficient in sampling than the conventional method. And the basic idea here is that this method decides the next sample based on the Hamilton dynamics, which guarantees the next sample has a higher probability over the previous sample. This allows us to sample very efficiently, and the sample can converge quickly to the true distribution. So once we have samples, then we can replace this integration by the sample average. And after we rearrange this equation, we have this equation. So now we have another integral. This integral is over the landmark ZT, right? Landmark ZT. So now what we need to do is we need, and even though this follows a Gaussian distribution, we still cannot analytically solve this integration. So we're going to approximate it by the sample average again. So this time we're going to sample landmarks from this probability distribution, right? This probability distribution. And this probability distribution, so we're going to sample J is the index sample from this distribution. And this sample is, we do not need to perform MC sampling, but this is because this distribution is follows a Gaussian distribution. With only the diagonal elements of the covariance matrix. So that means each element of ZT is independent of each other. In other words, all the landmarks are independent of each other. So we can sample each landmark independently using the Gaussian sampling, right? Once we have the Gaussian sampling, right, and we're going to sample n of them. So this gives us the n set of landmarks corresponding to each parameter wi. So we have a total of m times n samples, right? And then we can write this equation. So we have a double summation, right, are used to approximate these double integrations, right, double integrations. So once we have this equation, then we can perform argmax over this equation to obtain G star T, the case, right? So the basic idea here is that once we're going to have m times n set of landmarks, right? And then we're going to fit each of these landmarks to the model-based approach, right? And then we're going to generate a G star ij. So this is the ij, the best ij is corresponding to zt ij. So we're going to have a total of m times n G star ij, right? Then we average them. Well, we average this, right, over average them. That gives us the estimate of the G star T. So in other words, we have m times n samples of G star ij. And then the mean of these G samples give us the estimate of G star T. And also, from this m times n prediction of G star ij, we can also estimate the covariance matrix of G star. And this covariance matrix, we can compute it from the sample covariance matrix. So first we get the mean, then we can compute the sample covariance matrix. So this sample covariance matrix basically capture the uncertainty of G star. So this is sigma G star. So this is that capture the uncertainty of G star. And here, once we have G star and sigma G star, we can produce a probability map for each image, right? The probability map, and where the using the ellipse, right? So the center of this ellipse represent the case G star, and the area of the ellipse represent the uncertainty, which is computed from the covariance matrix. As you can see this here, we have different gates, right, at different locations, right? But this ellipse area varies. This one is much smaller than here. That means there's a larger uncertainty here, and there's much smaller uncertainty here, right? Okay, so now this is the overview of our method. So this is called a single stage overview of our method, right? Overview of our method. So this consists of 3 steps. Given an input image, we're going to perform 3 steps. The first step is we're going to first sample W from this posterior distribution of W. We are going to obtain M samples of W, right? And then from the M sample of W and the input, we'll be able to compute the M probability, conditional probability of landmarks given I and given each of the W, right? We have M of them. And then in the second step, from each of these conditional probability, we'll sample Z. So we're going to sample N sets of landmarks, right? So that is the purpose of step 2, right? And after step 2, we have a total of M times N sets of Z, right? And then we feed each of Z into the model-based method to generate a G star ij, right? G star ij. So the G star ij. And then once we have a total, so this leads to M times N G star ij, right? Then in the third step, we average them, we get our G star T, right? Estimate case. Then from this sample of G star ij, we can compute the sample covariance matrix. This gives us the sigma G star, sigma G star, that we can use to quantify the uncertainty of G star. Okay, so this is the one stage, right? We can also extend this to multi-stage, right? So this is the first stage, the input image, and then the Bayesian convolution neural network, and the output is the mean and the covariance matrix of the estimated gains, right? And then from here, we can generate the probability maps. So the probability map will serve as the one set of input for the second stage. In addition, in the second stage, we still have the eye image or face image, and through a convolutional neural network, we can generate the feature maps. And combine the probability map with the feature map, that they serve as the input to the second stage of the Bayesian convolutional network, which generates the its mean and the covariance matrix. The idea is that if we keep doing this, then we expect the estimated gains will be improved progressively with smaller covariance matrix. So that's the basic, that is what we call the cascade Bayesian convolutional neural network. So now I'm going to, this basically conclude the discussion of the theoretical parts of the proposed method. So now I'm going to show some experiment. Okay, first where I want to compare the Bayesian method against the non-Bayesian method. So we're going to evaluate the two non-Bayesian methods. One is the MLE, the other is the MAP. Now, the non-Bayesian method is also called the point estimation method. So each of these methods is going to, instead of a sample from the parameter of Bayesian neural network, each of these methods is going to estimate one set of best parameter for the Bayesian convolutional neural network. The MLE estimate the best parameter by maximizing the likelihood. MAP estimate the best parameter for the by maximize the posterior distribution of the parameters. A Bayesian approach, instead of using one set, it samples, but from the posterior distribution of the parameters. So this is the result on 4 benchmark data set. As you can see, this is for within data set evaluation. As you can see, the Bayesian methods, right? The Bayesian methods consistently outperform the non-Bayesian methods. So these two and the non-Bayesian methods. And the performance improvement is most significant for more challenging data set. For example, for eye depth data set, the improvement is more, the Bayesian method is improvement most significant over the non-Bayesian method. Similarly, the improvement is most significant for the UT data set. These two are more challenging compared to these two data sets. An average improvement of the Bayesian method over the non-Bayesian method is about 9.5% over the maximum likelihood and 6.8% over the MAP. So this is for the within data set. And we can also do the cross data set evaluation, where we train the 3 model using the UT data and then evaluate their performance on the 3 remaining data set. So this is the result. Again, we can see that the Bayesian method consistently outperforms the non-Bayesian method. And we can also see that the improvement of the Bayesian method over the non-Bayesian method is more significant for more challenging data sets. And overall, we see an average improvement of 12%, over 12% for the maximum likelihood, and 9% over the MAP. So you can see this improvement even is higher than this improvement. So this is a within data set, this is a cross data set. So that shows you that the Bayesian method can lead to a larger improvement over the point-based estimation method for cross data set eye tracking. In order to further evaluate our method, we want to generate some special extreme case evaluation, where we add the perturbation to the MPI dataset, right? So there are 2 types of perturbation, and one is the Gaussian noise. So we add a random noise to the input of the eye images, and another is a random occlusion. So we add some black square at a random location of the input eye images, and with different percentage. And here the Gaussian noise is with different amount of Gaussian standard deviation. And again, this is for the model is trained on UT, and as you can see that again, the Bayesian method significantly outperforms the non-Bayesian method, and the different amount of noise and the different amount of occlusion. So this study shows that the Bayesian method significantly outperforms the non-Bayesian methods, and the non-Bayesian method, in particular on challenging data set and the extreme perturbation occlusion with the input image. So now we're going to show the result comparison with state-of-the-art model-based method. So here I only focus on comparison with the model-based method. As you can see, so first is within dataset, but cross-subject evaluation. And we compare with this one method. And this is based on the facial landmarks. It's used facial landmarks. And this is the performance of Wang's method on the IDEP dataset. And this is ours. So you can see the improvement is quite significant. It's almost 3 degrees improvement, right? And this is the improvement over our method over the Wang's method on Columbia dataset. This improvement is not as significant. So this again shows that the improvement is more significant over the state-of-the-art model-based method on what? On more challenging dataset. And this is compared with a region-based model-based method. So this is the 2 methods using the I landmarks. And this is our comparison. On these 2 data sets, again, this is our method outperform this method. And again, as you can see, the improvement is more significant on the IDEP data set. And this is the comparison with this method, right? With this method. And again, the improvement is more significant on the UT, which is more challenging than the MPI dataset. And finally, this is within dataset. We also do cross dataset evaluation. So again, we train on UT and evaluate the performance on 3 remaining dataset. As you can see here, and this is again the region-based, right? This is the 2 region-based method, and the improvement is quite significant over this method for cross dataset eye tracking, almost 6 degrees, more than 6 degrees. But the improvement over this one is not as significant, and the improvement over the MPI is quite significant over this method, but not as significant as this method. So overall, we can say that our method essentially is a model-based method that significantly outperforms state-of-the-art model-based method, in particular on challenging data sets for both cross-subject and cross-dataset performance. However, I want to make a note that our method, if you look at these numbers, our method actually is worse than state-of-the-art learning-based method. This because, first, as a model-based method, our method does not need any ground truth annotation of the case, where the learning-based method requires ground truth annotation. So this is one issue with the model-based method. Another is the training data that we use. It's basically simply just the eye image. It's unlabeled. And the landmarks that we generate for each of these training eye image from the 4 benchmark data set is by a third-party landmark detector. We apply it directly without any refinement. So as a result, the landmark detection are not perfect. So we can say compared to the learning-based method, our method is essentially unsupervised, right? Unsupervised. That's why, that may explain why our method cannot outperform state-of-the-art learning-based method. So in summary, we introduce a Bayesian model-based eye tracking method that combines a Bayesian convolutional neural network with a model-based eye tracking method. Through Bayesian inference, the proposed method can perform model-based eye gaze estimation without explicit landmark detection, without explicit model training, and even without any ground truth gaze annotations. And the experiment on benchmark data set show the proposed method outperforms state-of-the-art model-based method, in particular on challenger and noise dataset, while achieving comparable within dataset performance on easy dataset. This basically concludes my presentation, and here are some related reference. And thank you for your attention.
Hello, everybody.
My name is Thad Starner. I'm a professor of computing.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Very nice talk. Thanks a lot.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Any questions?
So we are now open to questions, and on the chat there is a question from Sachin. And basically, what's the variance on the improvement with the Bayesian method? In another word, is the static significant? Can you see the?
We did not specifically do a statistical test, but on the compared to the on the challenging data sets, as you can see that the improvements are quite significant, right? On the easier data set, improvements are is marginal. I think it's comparable, to the existing model-based method. But for sure on the challenging data set, we such as MPI or UT data set, the performance is statistically significant. But we did not actually do that because it's a few degrees. If you compare with state-of-the-art method, right? It's not just less than 1 degree of improvement.
So yeah, I have one more question which I have put in the chat box. Yeah, so this framework is very nice in the sense that you highlighted the importance of not having ground truth. So it is purely unsupervised, which I really liked it. But the reality of, when we think of building eye trackers, we do collect some ground truth data, right? So my question is, if we do have some ground truth data, how can we incorporate into this framework, and what do you expect in terms of improvements? Can it beat the state of the art for purely data-driven methods?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, right? Basically, that means that you are talking about a hybrid method, right?
Yes.
So this is what we do here. Basically, it's a model-based method. We use the Bayesian neural network, basically try to address the issue of landmark detection. We didn't want to do a specific landmark detection. But if you do have annotation for eye gaze, right? Then I would think that maybe there's a combination of the learning-based with model-based. Maybe the result can be combined in the end. I think that would be, improve the result, in the end when you compare, depending on how much annotation you have, right? But in the meantime, it's also going to make the method specific to the data set, right? So we try not to use the gaze annotation on the specific data set, because we think there's some kind of bias, right, within the data set. And it may improve the performance on that particular data set, but in the meantime, it may not generalize to other data sets, which may have, right? So that's the main idea of model-based. We do not want to use the specific annotations here.
Thank you.
I actually have a follow-up question. So, do you ever think as you know, the personalization will improve the performance, right? And do you ever think you can use the personal data to fine-tune the model to have better performance for that person instead of more generic direction?
Yeah, I think you are going to another direction, right? You want to make it more specific for a person, right?
Yeah.
So right now you can see the parameters. A lot of these model-based parameters we use are pretty generic parameters, right? The theta parameter with the kappa angles, the radius. We basically use the average, right? And we can make them, those parameters more specific to one person. So in other words, the model-based parameter can be more accurate. Then we combine with we can also improve the landmark detection, right? Right now, the landmark detection we use is a third-party landmark detector. We did not even do any fine-tuning of those landmark detectors. So I think we can improve from the landmark detector, and then we can also improve the personal parameters for the theta for the person. But then it could be improve the specific performance for that individual. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So any question from the audience, please?
There is a couple. Do you want to read?
Oh yes, there's one question. What model did they use to map landmark to gaze?
This is the as you can see towards the end of the experiment, we use a two method, right? One is the facial landmark based method, right? The other is the eye region based landmark. So we have two, we use two landmark based method. Try to compare with that. The facial, actually, if you see, the facial landmark based method is one of the papers that we published last year or in the CVPR or SCCV, I forgot which year, using the facial landmark for model based estimation. And then we use another compare with another region-based landmark using the landmark on the eyelids. That's not our, but another method. And that's should be, if you look at the reference, I have a list of reference, right? It will show you that the model-based method that we compare with. Yeah.
Okay, great. Then I think that's all from questions. And let's thank Professor Changji for the nice talk.
Okay, thank you. Nice, yeah,
Thank you.
thank you, yeah.
Now, Oleg, do you want to introduce Tad for our next speaker?
Yes, it's my honor to introduce Seth Starner. So he's professor of computing at Georgia Tech, and he's also staff research scientist at Google. And he was one of the architects for Google Glass. And in 1990s, Ted coined the term augmented reality to describe the types of interfaces he envisioned for the future. And he had worn AR glasses for the last 27 years on everyday basis. And so I met Thad during ITRA, where he delivered an excellent keynote talk. It was in 2016, I think, if I am correct. And he was wearing Google Glass at that time. Thank you.
Hello, folks. My name is Thad Starner. I'm a professor of computing at Georgia Tech. I'm also a staff research scientist at Google and was a tech lead on Google Glass. Today's material is from my classes as a professor, not from Google. And I would like to talk to you today about eye interfaces for IR eyeglasses. My goal for many years now is to enable all-day head-worn displays to augment everyday life. I first started out with this in 1990, granting a grant to the Department of Defense on augmented reality, and to my knowledge, it's the first time that term was actually written down. I had a full system by 1993. You can see it here on the left-hand side, and that was originally designed to take better notes in classes. MIT Media Lab started funding a lot of the work on wearable computers. We created a group of it from 96 to 99 that actually had an annual budget there. And we did a lot of work in HCI, computer vision, augmented reality, AI, affect, fitness, just about everything in wearable computing we touched at one point or the other. And then from 2000 to 2010, I moved to Georgia Tech as a professor. And you note that while we could manage to get a display in the eyeglasses, we could never get a good interface besides a one-hand keyboard called the Twiddler. And that's because on-the-go interfaces are very hard. I should mention that the display that are in the eyeglasses, that's from 1997. That's a time-lapse photograph. The display was made by Mark Spitzer as an experiment when he was running Micro-Optical Corporation. It was a wonderful proof of concept. However, after about a month of using it, I gave up. It was only 320 by 240 resolution. Didn't run my Emacs system very well, and so I really couldn't live my life on that. I switched to a Micro-Optical SV6, which you see here on the right. From 2010 to 2012, I started using Google Glass as my primary machine. December 2010, I was working with the first version of Glass. It involved a laptop and a backpack and a cell phone strapped to my head, the display that was from the military. And this was using off-the-shelf parts just to prove what functionality we wanted. And yes, that cell phone was the only way we could get a touchpad that was multi-touch at the time. Nothing else was available. The system developed rapidly from 2011 to 2012. One of the big observations was we wanted to go lightweight. Originally, Glass was a much heavier weight, bigger system, much more like the Nreal today or even the HoloLens. But the Lennon system in 2011 really pushed things towards lightweight so that people could use it in their daily life. Generally, you want to get systems under 75 grams with a nose rate under 30 grams. Glass was 45 grams. The reason I bring up all this stuff is that there was actually an eye interface on Glass. There still is. It was a proximity sensor that aims at the right eye to detect winks and blinks. By 2012, we were becoming public about Glass, and the founders of Google, Larry and Sergey, would wear these things in public. They were very active in the project, and they were using these things in their daily life. That's Sergey on the New York subway in the upper picture, and Larry at his friend's wedding in the lower picture. We started shipping them to Friends in 2013, and public purchase from 2014 to 2015. From 2015 to 2019, we had the Glass Enterprise Edition that was available for purchase, first for limited partners and then for more public purchase. And last year we introduced Google Glass Edition 2. That makes Glass one of the oldest head-worn display families out there. Inspired a lot of academic research, including a lot of eye interfaces, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I believe Glass XC is probably one of the best selling head-worn displays up to its time, if I understand things correctly. So the question is, why are people so interested in head-worn displays? We certainly took a look at it for Glass. That's why we had that wink and blink interface. And Larry was really interested in solving one thing, which was reducing the time from an intention to action. In other words, from the user's idea that they want to do something to their first action to do it, can we get that time as small as possible? And in my research up to that time, it really showed that if you could get the time between intention and action to 2 seconds or under, people will use it all the time, just like a cell phone, like a wristwatch. People don't think about checking the time, they just do it. They don't even are aware of it sometimes. Once you get your interface slower than 4 seconds, it tends to become a very big barrier for actually using it for more time, or using it in your daily life. And so the hope is that making eye interfaces allows people to refer to the computer quickly for these micro interactions. Another reason to do eye interfaces is subtlety. A lot of folks would really like to be able to check a message without other people being aware of it during a meeting, or if you are deaf or hard of hearing, be able to read captions on a display and be able to control the caption on the display without necessarily calling attention to yourself and your disability. There's also a sense of privacy with the systems. You don't want to necessarily speak out loud in public when using them. Some folks, like folks who do order picking in big warehouses, their hands are full, so being able to control a head-worn display with eyes would be extremely useful. Another benefit is you don't have to have an external controller. You can sell one device, one pair of eyeglasses. This was a big push in Glass in the early days. We wanted to sell one device, not have rings or anything else that was necessary to control the system. And finally, a lot of folks get very excited about having a interface you can integrate with physical reality, being able to click on objects, that sort of thing. And we'll get to that in the future of this talk. Of course, probably the biggest point of these head-worn displays and eye interfaces is that Hollywood makes it look cool. And yes, your grad students or software engineers saw this movie when they were 10 years old. So for a lot of them, the thing that formed their memories of what eye interfaces should be was this Iron Man interface. Unfortunately, there's no way you're going to be able to fit that interface in this mask. If you look at the video from Iron Man, he's looking around inside the mask, and that mask is not that big. If you're actually doing an eye interface like that, it'd be more like on the right-hand side here, like an astronaut's helmet. And yeah, you could probably do a pretty good Iron Man interface in the astronaut's helmet, but it's very few people who would wear that around in daily life. With eye interfaces, there are many challenges. One of the biggest is that sunlight tends to swamp the illumination of the camera if you're doing bright pupil or dark pupil, or you're trying to do glint detection. Oftentimes the sunlight will just wash out the glints or add extra glints, or just cause the camera to white out. So that's a difficult problem to deal with, and there's lots of ways you can approach it, but the amount of variability you get when walking or driving or being on the go is quite hard. A bigger problem that people underestimate is fit. Trying to make a camera into a head-worn display so that you always can see the eye is surprisingly difficult. The glasses slide around the face, and you often lose sight of the eye or lose calibration this way. So one of the biggest issues, though, one of the biggest challenges is showing the benefit for the cost. And here I mean the cost of fashion and social weight, how good the glasses work, how good the glasses look, also how they sit on the nose. Do they add too much weight to the nose? Do they reduce the battery life too much or cause the battery to be too bulky? And also the cost. So as soon as you put eye interfaces into a system, there are a huge number of things you got to consider, and it all comes down to, is the interface benefit sufficient? Now, there are a lot of potential benefits out there, and these are some of them that are commonly talked about when people talk about head-worn displays. Let's talk about the first one, which is replacing the mouse, and this is probably the most common one. So a simple question is, why aren't interfaces, why aren't eye interfaces already used for pointing on desktops? And the simple thing is that pointing accuracy is not very good with eye interfaces. Eyes are only under semi-conscious control. They're dancing around all the time. And it's hard to get an intentional and exact movement without having a destination target. Now you can make interfaces with destination targets so that it becomes easier, but you can't just have people look at like a certain angle and expect that to work. The other problem is that eye movements tend to be very jerky. They're saccading, so you're not getting a continuous movement unless you're following a slow target. And finally, you get a lot of user interface problems when you have misalignment of the cursor with where the person is looking. So it feels like you're continually chasing the cursor or leading the cursor, and that leads to a bad user experience. Another problem is that pointing accuracy is surprisingly unreliable as far as the fovea is concerned. Your fovea is 2 degrees, and so on a high-resolution display like what I'm using right now for narrating this talk, that's about 170 pixels. That's a lot of imprecision to not know what the user is looking at. So, if you're trying to do a drawing program or clicking on the edges of a window, it might be very hard to do that sort of fine, precise control. The other problem with misalignment comes with the fovea is the fact that because the fovea is so small, if your misalignment is too big, your user is actually having a hard time seeing what their eyes are pointing at. So that can be another frustrating part of the experience. Finally is the idea of interface speed. You really have to make a system that can keep up with the eyes. They're very fast. They're the fastest movement in the human body, 700 degrees per second. Saccades are generally 15 to 20 degrees typical and up to 40 degrees in range. They're also very fast. Another thing that limits your interface is that saccades have a refractory period. It takes about 100 to 200 milliseconds before you can saccade again. Now, this can be a benefit. If you are trying to use your eyes to show people, your eyes as a cursor to show people what you're doing, it's very difficult because they have a hard time following it because by definition your saccades are probably moving just ahead of theirs. Just humans, it's very hard to actually see what the other person is doing with their eyes. This could also be a benefit. One thing I heard about was an MIT interface where they had a wall of text displayed publicly in Russian, but when the user scanned it, when the user used it, read it, every place they looked was translated from Russian to English, and so the user could read it, but everybody else around them couldn't. And I thought that was a clever use of the speed of eye interfaces. Another standard problem I think you all are aware of is selection dwells are challenging. Even when you're fixated, you still have about a degree of movement, and that's on top of the 2 degrees of imprecision of the fovea. Fixations normally are between 200 and 600 milliseconds. Longer are fatiguing, so if you're going to have people wait for a second to click on something, they're going to get tired of their interface pretty quickly. On the other hand, if you make your interface select based on dwell time too quickly, you get the minus touch effect where they're just getting spurious mouse clicks all over the place. Going the extreme limit on slow, however, if your eyes don't move, and in this case I'm talking about anesthetizing the muscles of the eyes, your vision disappears. Your eyes need movement in order to actually refresh and see the world. So given this problem with using dwells for selection, a lot of interfaces replace dwelling with button presses. Some folks try eye blinks, but they are also semi-conscious control. People tend to try to go with more secure button presses or something for enabling or controlling or clutching the eye movements. So whenever my students propose an eye interface, I always ask them to check out the next closest alternative and tell me why we need eye interfaces versus the other next best choice. And for things like a mouse pointer, a head mouse is a pretty good solution. Just put the cursor in the center of the screen and you pitch or yaw your head to control the X or Y location of the mouse. Now, this is very conscious control, and the body really tries to keep the head stable, so you can even do this somewhat while you're walking if you're not trying to do anything too precise. It's incredibly cheap to do. It's just an IMU, low power, low weight, less fatiguing. And so it really does seem like a pretty good, viable alternative to pure eye tracking. The problem is it's slow. It also has a high social weight. If you're in a meeting, having people see you move your head around is a little bit suspicious. You can do interfaces with head movement with very subtle interfaces, very subtle movement. The problem is as soon as you try to do subtle movement while walking, then you have a signal to noise ratio, so you really have to adjust your gain control to make something that's both subtle and works in a mobile environment. Another alternative to using the eyes as a mouse is for eye gesture commands. Now this is stuff that was done by Drews and Schmidt in 2007. And they basically just said, okay, we're going to have 8 different locations or directions you can move your eyes, and they correspond to the different corners on a screen. And they just define different gestures for different activities you want to do. And this was very successful. They had pretty good accuracy, pretty good precision, not too many false positives from what I can tell. This is a viable way to go. The only problem is that you really have to have your users memorize what the gestures are. Now, that's sort of against good interface design. Don Norman has a wonderful essay called Gesture Interfaces, A Step Backwards in Usability. I highly recommend it. Whenever my students propose a gesture system, eyes or hand or any sort of gesture system, I always insist that they address Don's objections here. First of all, for these things like these eye gestures, they're not visible. You can't see what's available to you to do, and so the user just has to memorize all the different commands and be able to reproduce them on the fly. It's also hard to get feedback to the user because they're saccading all around already. They don't have the ability to saccade to a feedback location. If they do, there's a good chance that they will mess up their current eye gesture. It's hard to discover new gestures to do, and this is something that is only really solved by showing all the gestures all the time. That's not really feasible with a lot of these head-worn displays. Great part of the eye gestures is they're reliable. They are pretty good. You can make the interface consistent throughout the interface if you want, and it's scalable in the sense that it can work on a large screen or a small screen, a desktop screen or a wearable computer screen. The only thing you have to worry about really is your field of view. You are probably not going to be able to do it with a screen that's too big or a screen that's too small, but for most everything that you're going to see in common use, it should work out pretty well. Now, there's another alternative, which is a synchronized gesture interface. Now, this was first done, I believe, by Estevez in a system called Orbits in WIST 2015. And they were using, I think, a Tobii eye tracker on a desktop to control an interface on a wristwatch. We were trying to do something more self-contained. We used something called a Jin's Meme, which is a pair of EOG glasses. It just has 3 electrodes. It's pretty crude in the sense that you're just getting an X and Y, a delta XY signal. But even with that, you can do surprisingly fast and effective interfaces with this synchronized interface. I'll just play the video here so you guys can see a sense of what's going on.
Solar System, smooth pursuit interactions using EOG glasses. Solar System allows the user to select options without using his hands by recognizing smooth eye movements. We introduce a few application scenarios for the Solar System. First of all, to read the eye movement, we use the Jin's Meme glasses with 3 EOG electrodes. Jin's Meme detects vertical and horizontal eye movement. From the eye movement data of the user following the orbiting dot, we can calculate polar coordinates of the orbiting dot and recognize which orbit the user is following. And for forced choice binary selection, we've already evaluated a 2.6 bits per second input rate at 250 milliseconds per input. Solar System could be useful in cases when the user is unable to use his hands, for example, in a cooking situation, or in situations when it is relatively hard to operate a device using hands, for example, while driving. Solar System can easily interact with any other systems since it is implemented using the TCP/IP socket communication.
So the idea here, of course, is that you have different icons, different prompts, and you have a circling satellite that you track with your eyes, depending on which prompt you want. And you can do multiple selections or multiple things on the screen at the same time. The big problem here, of course, is that you're using up some real estate for those little orbiting cursors, but really it's not that much. And like I said, surprisingly stable system. Now, if we go look back at Don Norman's objections to this, this system is visible because you've got an orbiting cursor, you know it's active. You can give the user feedback because you can, as they get closer and closer to selecting it, you can change the color of the thing or make it larger. It's discoverable because everything's on the screen that has a cursor, and it's, like I said, surprisingly reliable. And it's scalable. This works on just about any size screen. About any field of view, as long as it's within what humans can perceive. Within a limit. It's probably very hard to use something that's less than a degree or two, but generally for most displays you care about, this will work just fine. Now, when we look at head-worn displays, one of the biggest problems is text entry, and like I said, I use a twiddler, a one-handed keyboard to solve this problem. But it'd be nice if we can make it all self-contained. So a lot of people have looked at text entry using eye tracking, eye interfaces to solve this problem. Now a good goal here is about 40 or 50 words per minute. That's the average speed of a mobile phone expert. It's also a pretty decent desktop speed. If you do a dwell keyboard where you're just dwelling on each letter to select it, you're limiting yourself to 12 to 24 words per minute. However, you do a shape writing thing where you're going between, you start at the first letter and try to go through all the different letters in the word and end up with the last letter. That's an excellent way to do things with touchscreen typing, but it's a challenge for eye interfaces because the user is often visually searching for the next letter, which causes the path to have spurious wrong moves and possibly inserting characters. When you test these systems, I recently found a student project on this at KTH. They were showing about 7.3 words per minute for word level systems and 9.4 words per minute for phrase level, where you just keep going from word to word to word. One of the coolest keyboards in this space is, I think, by Morimoto. And this is where you're switching between two keyboards. You have the first keyboard at the top, second keyboard at the bottom, and if I was going to type my name, I would search for the T with my eyes till I find it, and then as soon as I find it, I switch to the bottom keyboard and search for the H, then the top keyboard A, bottom keyboard D. And what happens is what we're looking at here is the switch of context to figure out when a letter was selected instead of dwell. So as I'm looking at the T, when I go through the yellow center to H, I then back up the path to see where was the last stopping point before I start on that path through the yellow center, and that will tell me which letter I was on. This, I think the average words per minute were 12, but you can see here that their best export was over 20 words per minute, which is pretty astonishingly good. What's cool about this is it alleviates the dwell issue, allows the user to search visually and not hurt themselves when trying to type. And it also raises the possibility of mapping gestures to words. Because suppose my calibration was off, and instead of doing THAD, I was off to the left a little bit. And so I end up doing RG off-screen S. And there's no word that matches that. And so we can probably figure out that it should be THAD just by looking at a little bit of translation here in the path. So we probably only need relative precision here in, at least for small dictionary situations, probably even large dictionary situations. You can probably get away with relative precision instead of absolute accuracy in where your eyes are pointing. Another system that is iWrite. This is a system done by Jake Walbrook. And basically, you're going from corner to corner in sort of a unistroke pattern. You get about 5 to 8 words per minute on it. It's relatively gross motions. Again, the problem here is the user has to memorize the letters. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Dasher. Dasher is a very interesting interface in that it's predictive. It tries to arrange letters by the probabilities, and you just use relative motion of your eyes to select which letters are coming up. It's intense visual focus, but only relative accuracy is needed here. All you gotta do is move the cursor up and down, left and right. However, the calibration is off. It might be difficult to see the letters to target. Interestingly enough, you can get about 17 words per minute with this, which is quite good for these interfaces. The real question here, though, is the benefit of having this text entry system overcome the detriment to the fashion and the social weight and the physical properties of the device. And so I'm of two minds on this one. I don't think we're there yet. This certainly can be done for heavier weight systems like VR systems, but for AR glasses, we're trying to wear them around everyday use. It's hard. Now let's also talk about eye on screen and focus regions. These are less rigorous versions of absolute accuracy. You can imagine having a system that it only listens to your speech when you're looking at the screen, or only listens to gestures made with your wristwatch when you're looking at the screen. So having the eye on screen as a potential clutch, that might be a good idea, but it is something that you still have to worry about false positives per hour and accuracy. You have a similar thing with focus regions for photography. Folks, some of these DSLRs already, you can look at these different regions and select the focus for that image. Okay. One thing that folks get very excited about, again, is a world-facing camera, coupling that with eye tracking and try to figure out an object of interest. This idea has been around for literally decades. Probably some of the first interesting research on it was Michael Land, who showed that during a task, in a manipulating task, you're looking at the relevant objects about 82% of the time. Even before the task, you're looking at them about 50% of the time. So the idea is that we can get some idea of the user's context and what they're doing by combining the inner-looking eye-tracking camera and the outer-looking world camera. Now, of course, the alternative here is just simple computer vision. Turns out 95% of the time, the eyes are within plus or minus 15 degrees of center. So if you just do computer vision in that 30-degree cone and look for hands and objects in motion, you can basically predict what the user is looking at already. This is Alireza Fathi's PhD dissertation, where he shows that he can predict the user's gaze pretty well just with this method. And here he's seeing that you're pouring some milk into a cup. You pretty much know what's going on there as far as the attention. Now, some things I'm most bullish about as far as thinking that they are possible and useful are authentication, DON-DOF, and physiological signals. Now, physiological signals, just for those who aren't familiar with this, there is a symptom called nystagmus, where your eye vibrates a little bit when you're under the influence. And so when that police officer runs a pen light back and forth in front of your eyes, what they're really looking at is for your eyes to vibrate. And that indicates you're under the influence. So you can imagine having all sorts of physiological stuff where you occasionally prompt the user or ask them to do things and get some physical responses. This might be good for trying to titrate pharmaceuticals, for example. So I really kind of like this space. You can require power rarely to do things. It's often simply a binary decision, and you can gather evidence over many seconds to figure out what's going on. Good trade-off here. I really like the authentication stuff because it's a rare and short interaction when you're first logging into the system. You can have active participation of the user where they're willing to move around and try to get their eye in the right situation for authentication. One thing I didn't mention yet is reading auto-scrolling. This is another eye gesture, and this is a pretty simple thing to do. You just look at the eyes going back and forth and automatically scroll text for the user. So here are my suggested future directions. I really believe in these 4 things right now, at least from what the technology I'm seeing. And if folks are interested, the International Symposium on Wearable Computers coming up September 12th, where there's a lot more people like me who are intent on wearing computers around in daily life and really get a sense of for what these things are most useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ted. So there was a lovely discussion on the chat with different questions. Thank you so much for utilizing this time to answer people's questions. So my favorite question, and I know I asked you offline about user authentication. So it's interesting that for user authentication with eye tracking, we have different methods. So if we are using video calligraphy system, we can do iris recognition, we can do eye movements, or we can do gaze pin entry. There are multiple applications on these topics. And you mentioned that it's one of the important areas. So can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, one of the things I like about using authentication is that it can be a very low power interface. You're just using it for authentication once while you have the system on. And then you don't have to authenticate again until the glasses see you pull it off. And so you can do it, and you can have the user be very cooperative with you. And so, a simple way to do it is just put a camera in the corner. You look at when you put your sensors on, it authenticates you, and then you're good until your next session. Now that's iris, but I mean, there's lots of systems you've done in the past as well. Lots of different tricks you can do for that. The other thing I had on my list is the DON-DOF. Just being able to turn on the camera a frame every minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes and making sure that you're still got a live eyeball there helps with the authentication problem, and also helps to know when people are doing this versus doing this, so you don't get a lot of false input.
Great, thank you so much. And in your list of applications, did you have foveated rendering? Because foveated rendering is one of the key ways to reduce the amount of energy that the device needs to generate the environment.
Right. So a lot of folks are pushing for high resolution, high field of view glasses. I believe that's a red herring, at least for everyday wear glasses, because there's no way that we know of right now to make glasses that aren't too heavy to wear that have those features. So as soon as you start talking about high field of view, you make your nose weight more than 30 grams, and people just won't wear it. And that's, when you're doing a high-end system, like a high-end VR system, it makes more sense. What's also nice about a VR system is that you're completely controlling the lighting environment, and so you can block all the external infrared. So there, it makes a heck of a lot more sense. But for the type of glasses I make, where you're walking about them in daily life, foveated rendering is way down the list for the future, I'm afraid.
I see.
We had a question earlier on about
the swipes.
Question.
The swipes about so you were mentioning information about the gaze gestures, and I think Sion Wook asked about what about swipes, and you mentioned and you asked to ask it again.
Yes. So the idea is, like, if in a perfect world, having a keyboard just go back and forth with, which I showed in the presentation, that already exists. The question is, and right now it's under 10 words per minute is what I'm seeing. Whereas that dual keyboard one was much faster. You could see, the expert was at 20 words per minute. Question is, what's the limit? And so I did some calculations while my talk was going on, and here's what I found. He says confidently, as my cut and paste does not work. Okay, here we go. There we go. So one thing we might do a quick thing. The question is, how many? Suppose you can select a letter per saccade. How many saccades per second can you make? And in my case, it's 3. I just tested myself. And so that ends up being about 36 words per minute is the top rate that I can go. And that's assuming that I instantly find I go from one letter to another. So I'd like to do a quick experiment with everybody. So this is now audience participation time. I'm going to put up a calendar. Can I actually share my screen? Yes, I think I can. Let's see here. Yep, here we go. Here's a clock. So hopefully this comes up. There we go. So what I'd like you to do is, for 10 seconds, just go from when the clock second hand gets to the top, go from the top to the 2 o'clock position for 10 seconds, back and forth as quickly as you can. Ready? Go. And count them. Okay, so I got 29. Was anybody else able to do that? Can you see if anybody else is typing anything in the chat?
Yeah, I was trying to do it in my kind of the background material. So all our visual systems are a little bit different. Some people have express saccades where they break it in between. So for me, it's slower. So I have some express saccades in my eye trace, but yeah, people are.
All right, so we got 30, 15, 26, 12, 19, 20. Yeah, so my 3 per second seems to be an upper limit. And of course, selecting between 26 letters plus space plus backspace, that's about 4.8 bits per character you're doing. And so that ends up, in the brain computer world, that ends up being around, let's see here, I have it calculated out here, ends up being about 864 bits per minute. So you might be able to improve this by selecting not just letters, but triplets of letters or combinations of them. But that's going to take a lot of effort. What I think, suppose you do stenotype, where you're typing in phonemes or syllables. So you're doing like 3-letter pairs. That for them to get up to speed requires about 2 years of practice. And so, you might do things like add just ing, the, and, that sort of stuff as additional things. You might get yourself up to 40 words per minute, but the idea that you're going to be able to saccade and have every saccade being meaningful for an extended period of time is not really possible. So I think this 36 words per minute is pretty good as a upper limit. And notice that's not bad. It's faster than Hunt and Peck typing on a QWERTY keyboard. Which is pretty good, actually. And I think that that's an okay rate on a mobile phone. So if you could hit that 36 word per minute rate, it'd be fine. The other thing people suggest is completion. Problem with completion is that at certain speeds, completion actually slows you down. and I'm trying to do a test right now to figure out at what speeds that happens. So yeah, I think we're going to be stuck around 36 max.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much. So we are at 1:40. Sachin, do you want to? I have more questions, of course, and other
one
people.
last question on Q&A, if you can answer that.
Yeah, the question on Q&A.
So the question of Cayman was from Kimar Green from Johns Hopkins University. And so he's indicating that actually, so let's say if you assume eye movements is one of the major input channels for our interfaces, so we also know from the neurological studies that people age. And so in this case, many properties of saccades and other eye movements change. And so have you thought about how, let's say in the future, where potentially we might have more AR reality devices, how it would affect the sort of the input in those types of interfaces?
Yeah, I am, as you can tell from the talk, sort of a pessimist when it comes to, using the eyes as an interface for typing or mouse. I think your best bet is this smooth pursuit stuff that I showed with the the orbiting cursors. So you can have multiple orbiting cursors around many different things on your screen at the same time, and select things that way. That you generally don't lose that unless there's something medically wrong with your eyes. So I think that'll be probably immune to a lot of the age effects, is my guess. I don't really have data to prove that. Besides that, I haven't really looked at, because of the type of interfaces I do, I haven't looked at age-related effects with saccades. That's a very interesting point. I think after 30, things start degrading for haptics as well, and loss of acuities. So I could completely see age-related effects. Good thing to test. Very good thing to test. Good to know that. If they have a reference, please paste it in the chat. I'd like to see that reference.
Great. Thank you so much again. Thank you for taking time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Tad. Appreciate it. So yeah, with that, I think we have all the speakers. So now, just I'll offer some closing thoughts on the workshop, and then we'll invite Rob Kevin, who is driving the research initiatives for eye tracking at FRL, to speak some words. And yeah, so can you play the closing thoughts? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sachin Talati, machine learning lead and research scientist for the eye tracking team at Facebook Reality Labs in Redmond, Washington. As a member of the organizing team from Facebook Reality Labs, I want to offer some closing thoughts on this workshop that we organized in collaboration with our academic partners from ETH Zurich and University of Birmingham. For starters, I just want to say thank you. In this unprecedented environment of COVID-19 induced pandemic that all of us are living through, successful organization of an event such as this workshop and the OpenEyes challenge would not have been possible without close collaboration with several individuals and partner teams. I want to begin by graciously thanking the ECCV conference organizers for their decision to keep the conference alive and for providing the necessary infrastructure support to allow us to stream this workshop live through Zoom. I want to thank the sponsors, NVIDIA, Toby, and of course, Facebook Reality Labs. Thank you to all the workshop organizers, including our academic collaborators with whom we joined forces to host the OpenEyes workshop. I want to also give a shout out to the leadership at FRL to allow us to publicly share eye dataset collected at FRL using an experimental head-mounted VR headset, which made the second iteration of OpenEyes challenge possible. Thank you to all the invited speakers who graciously accepted our invitation to speak at this workshop in this revised format. Thank you to all the participants and winning teams for the OpenEyes challenge. It was quite encouraging to see such a global participation from teams all over the world. Also, thank you to all the individuals who submitted their research papers to this workshop. We were quite impressed with the overall quality of submissions that we received. It was for sure a hard decision for us to down-select 4 papers that we accepted for publication for this workshop. And finally, thank you to the audience who attended this workshop today. I want to now briefly highlight some of the key reasons for why we at FRL, our tracking team, are engaged in the organization of this workshop and the eye tracking challenge. We believe that eye tracking is a fundamental piece of tech that will power next generation of AR and VR headsets. While we are actively working to address some of the outstanding challenges for mass adoption of eye tracking in AR and VR, we feel that the cutting-edge research in CV and machine learning has a lot to offer to bootstrap the progress in eye tracking. As such, this workshop and OpenEyes challenge is our attempt to get a brain share of diverse group of interdisciplinary researchers in CV and ML who can bring their expertise together to solve some of the outstanding problems in eye tracking. We are quite happy to see the diversity of topics that is covered in the workshop today. And we are hopeful that this type of engagement is not only beneficial to us in our endeavor to adopt eye tracking for AR and VR platform, but also can benefit advancing the state of eye tracking research. This is the second year for us to host eye tracking challenge. These challenges were designed to address aspects of problem areas that we feel are very important to truly advance the state of eye tracking for AR and VR that will work for the masses. For example, last year, the challenge topics were chosen around the theme of ground truth for eye tracking. Data-driven models for eye tracking can only be as good as data, and hence the importance for ground truth. This year, the theme for the challenge was around the topic of spatial temporal dynamics for eye tracking. What are the learnings from these challenges and what next? To offer some perspective on this, I would like to invite Rob Cavan, who is driving various research efforts in eye tracking at FRL, to say a few words.
Hey everyone, I'm Robert Cavan. Eye tracking.
Yeah. So Rob, do you want to speak live?
Sure, I can go live. I did record some relatively well formulated thoughts if anyone wants to go back and see that video presentation, but I'll just kind of wrap up where Sachin left off. First, I'd really like to reiterate his thanks, especially our partners in the OpenEyes initiative, all the speakers, definitely the keynote speakers, our paper submission authors, and the challenge participants. I was actually very pleased myself, even knew more or less what the papers were going to be, but having seen them all presented in the conference and sort of the diversity of topics, it really made me feel great about this effort that I know that Sachin and his team have spent a tremendous amount of time putting together. So also thanks to you, Sachin. I just wanted to share my thoughts really quickly on the state of eye tracking. One of the things that I always feel is if you're not part of the eye tracking community, it can really feel like eye tracking is more or less a solved problem except for X. In brutal honesty, I'm relatively infamous even around the Facebook Reality Labs for making very bold predictions when I first started working on eye tracking here. It feels like a tractable problem. But the truth is, whatever those X's are, that the not solved parts. So, maybe it's slippage. We've talked about environmental noise. We've talked about the need to maybe do calibration for each user. And then of course, if we think about AR or VR platforms, we have all of the, just the size, the conspicuity, the power, and of course, privacy. These become really big problems. And so our actual challenge is to solve all of these not in isolation, but to solve them all together. And we have to solve all of these together in a way that still delivers very high speed eye tracking, very accurate eye tracking, and it has to cover, a large part of the range of eye motion. Even though we might not glance off to the side on a regular basis, it's still important for us to capture those sort of expressive eye movements. So, in my opinion, that means that there is quite a bit of research ahead, and especially here, when we think about solving all these together, we're probably going to have to change our approaches, right? There's a lot of sort of history in eye tracking, and I'm not convinced that we can just take traditional video occulography and shove it in an AR device, for example, that looks like a lightweight pair of glasses and have it work in all scenarios. I mean, they're just form factor challenges that I think Dr. Stamer talked about in his presentation. I mean, I was actually really, again, I want to iterate how pleased I was to see the variety of problems that were presented in this talk. So like Dr. Kuznecki, presented on some of the work they're doing on the algorithms and alternative hardware approaches. Dr. Kamis really, bringing up privacy, that we can't stress how important that is as we move into sort of like this, future of pervasive eye tracking. Dr. Edie, looking at this, at saliency and like how we can leverage these priors about how humans actually interact with their environments to improve eye tracking. I think this is an important aspect. Dr. Z, thinking about how we do a much better probabilistic formulation of this problem. Real processes in the world are not certain. And then, Dr. Stamer, I think, the great thing about his talk is just setting realistic expectations for what human-computer interaction using eye tracking will look like. I think it's not a straightforward answer, and there's tons of research in that avenue as well. I think there are a lot of challenges, and I think that with AR and VR especially, there's like this sort of renewed necessity for eye tracking to be awesome. I mean, if we can really have eye tracking that we depend on, we can start that process towards these wide field of view displays that actually are in glasses form factor. I know Dr. Stamer said, in the near term that's kind of a red herring, and I don't disagree that that's a really challenging thing to do. But obviously for these sort of long-term vision of AR, it's a real key. The ability to understand and better understand like the user's attention and what they're trying to do in the world. A major aspect of AR for our team is helping people get access to the information that they're looking for in the lowest friction way possible, right? Like just how can we get them that information quickly? And then the third tier, which I was also happy to see brought up, was really just the sort of physiological aspects, helping people understand themselves better, understanding health. So there's a ton of really interesting research to do. And in my opinion, there's extraordinary value if we solve this problem. And this is exciting to me, right? I think that really the next decade will be a renaissance for eye tracking. I think all the components are there. I think we should all be excited to be a part of that. Our particular work sort of spans a lot of the areas that were presented today. But of course, I think Sachin was sort of asking, when we think about, let's say, this conference, if we do it again next year, what are the likely focus for our team? And I think this actually falls most closely with Pramad's talk earlier on fusing common filters with, let's say, deep learning models. So we know that deep learning has demonstrated, some really impressive results in certain scenarios. These sort of data-driven solutions like deep learning are great at interpolating. So if you can capture a data set that completely encompasses all of the challenges that you face, then we have a good chance of solving the problem. But when we think about the diversity of eye tracking hardware solutions out there, the diversity of environments, of facial shapes, things like that, collecting that data set is extremely challenging. And it might not be super obvious, but when you are building even a VR device, as the display systems change and as the architecture changes, that puts pretty extreme pressure on the eye tracking system. And so we can't necessarily rely on the eye tracking system from, it's not going to be a fixed thing over time. So we need to think about how we take the power of those data-driven models and fuse it with traditional model-based approaches. So obviously model-based approaches have the benefit of extrapolating to new inputs very well. They're quite good at prediction. One of the challenges that they face, though, is, of course, that conversion between the raw data signal into the signal that can be consumed by these models. is, often fragile. It's kind of human crafted. And then the models themselves are relatively simplistic, analytical models that we can sort of intuit and put together, but they don't really represent reality. And so next year, I think it's going to be really interesting for us to think how we fuse the combination of strengths between each of these two approaches to leverage and really develop completely new ways of thinking about eye tracking. So, I hope that I want to try it. Dr. Karnagaker? No. Karganeker, thank you. Sorry, this is a new name for me. But I really appreciated his talk. It was inspiring to me. I hope his talk and all the other talks were inspiring to all of you. And we really look forward to your participation at the next OpenEyes workshop next year. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for the great summary. So with this, I think we are at the end of the workshop, and hopefully next year we'll have a similar engagement in person. That's from this year, hopefully. But thank you again, everyone who participated. Yeah, all the updates will be posted on the website. So check it out if you want to look at the talks that we presented today. So Dr. Wang, who is our academic collaborator, do you have any final thoughts to offer before we close?
Okay. So thank you very much. Thanks a lot for all the helps and for the excellent talks and for the papers submitted. And it was truly a fascinating workshop, and it went very smoothly, especially under this difficult situation. And I think our organizing workshop helps a lot the developing of this eye gaze community, and we can continue this excellent workshop in the following years. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you. Take care. Bye, everyone. See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Rob, you want to stay on for a sec?
Sure.
I don't know how we do breakout rooms here or anything like that.